For centuries, the Vatican's forbidden vaults have stirred one question: what could possibly be so dangerous that even time itself was told to keep quiet? Behind sealed doors, beneath marble courtyards and painted ceilings, lies a labyrinth of records the world was never meant to read. Files marked with words like exorcismi, causae miraculorum, and inquisitionis. They contain humanity's most uncomfortable stories, faith colliding with fear, science punished for curiosity, and miracles judged by men who feared proof. Some say the archives protect truth. Others whisper they protect power. Welcome to the 101 Archive. Tonight, we'll open the doors they swore would never be opened, uncovering the forbidden and unsolved mysteries hidden deep inside the Vatican archives. From trials the Church erased, to relics that defy explanation, to letters that might rewrite everything we thought we knew about faith itself. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy uncovering the world's hidden histories, don't forget to subscribe. Get comfortable, because once we step inside these vaults, what we find may not want to be found. You begin in the dim, climate-controlled vaults beneath the Cortile del Belvedere, where light feels rationed and silence weighs as heavily as stone. For centuries, these rooms were closed, even to most clergy, guarded by Swiss halberds and the Latin phrase Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, a name that never meant forbidden, only private. Yet the effect was the same, secrecy as power. Within this labyrinth lie traces of the Church's encounters with the unexplainable, the doubtful, and the dangerous. Historians who have since been granted access describe the meticulous order of the shelves. Boxes labelled exorcismi, religionis variae, causae miraculorum. These are not rumours, but catalogue entries listed in inventories prepared after Leo XIII allowed limited scholarly visits in 1881. Each file bears the calm handwriting of a bureaucrat, yet the content reads like an anthology of humanity's fears. A small portion of these records has been verified publicly. Cases reviewed by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1637 and 1642, complete with the Latin formulas authorizing ritual interventions. They reveal that exorcisms were not medieval improvisations, but legal acts, performed only after episcopal approval. Reports from parish priests in the 17th century detail individuals possessed by the adversary, naming witnesses and the physicians called to distinguish illness from influence. The Church demanded evidence before approving an exorcism, turning the supernatural into a kind of paperwork. What was once whispered became record. These exchanges confirm a discipline of quiet correction, a kind of internal hygiene. The faithful were never informed. Only the notaries and the storage clerks knew. The paperwork even prescribed how many candles must burn and how long the cleric must fast. In that sense, the extraordinary was domesticated, framed by canon law. Other documents show the opposite impulse, the urge to suppress anything that might discredit the institution. Inside correspondence from dioceses in France and the Low Countries, archivists found references to relics withdrawn from veneration after doubts about authenticity emerged. A bishop would write to Rome that a bone, once believed to belong to a martyr, had proven animal. The reply came curtly, "Remove without scandal." Such verified episodes invite a more disturbing question that no index can answer. How much was deliberately destroyed? No definitive evidence survives either way. The very files that might confirm or deny the charge would have been among those removed. Among Vatican conservators, there persists a debate, half ethical, half archival, about the documenti irrecuperabili. The term appears in internal restoration notes from the 1950s, designating materials beyond conservation and removed. Some scholars accept this as routine deacidification and culling. Others suspect it was also a euphemism for elimination of scandalous content. In interviews given after the archive's renaming in 2019 from Secretum to Apostolicum, officials insisted that nothing of historical value is ever destroyed. Yet, occasional contradictions surface. A Jesuit paleographer, Father Sandro Paggi, recounted in a conference that during a 1984 recataloguing he encountered references to folders that no longer existed, tagged Perdita non recuperata. He said they concerned an inquiry into a mystic in Umbria, 1786. The record of the inquiry remains missing. Whether lost, misfiled, or withdrawn, no one can say. Prudence also explains the unwritten rule, whispered among archivists, scandalum parvulorum vitandum est, avoid the scandal of the little ones. The maxim derives from Matthew 18:6, but became an administrative principle. Whenever a file risked shaking ordinary faith, it was marked riservato and restricted to higher curial ranks. The Church answers with silence, invoking the word prudence. The irony is that this same caution preserved extraordinary fragments of humanity. This practice is attested in the pre-war catalogues of the Congregation for Rights, where marginal notes identify certain folders as res, followed by initials of the custodian. These notations, visible only to trained researchers, outline the moral geography of secrecy, salvation first, transparency later. A report from 1610 describes a Spanish nun who claimed to levitate during prayer. The physician assigned to observe her noted that she rose by a span of the hand, but offered no explanation. A second observer added simply, non constat miraculum. In the margin a third hand wrote, send to archive. Thus skepticism and wonder coexist on a single page, evidence and doubt frozen together for 400 years. In the 20th century, professional archivists, trained historians rather than monks, began to impose new order. They classified the supernatural dossiers under Anthropologia Religiosa, acknowledging them as sources for cultural study rather than proof of miracles. Their work exposed a paradox. By rationalizing mystery, they ensured its survival. Every rule, every index entry, testifies that even the incredible deserved documentation. Researchers tell of a small locked cabinet, known colloquially as Armarium 12 bis. Its existence appears in an internal inventory from 1931, described simply as materials reserved to the supreme authority. The cabinet has since disappeared, and modern guides omit it. Some believe it once held confiscated esoteric manuscripts seized from private collectors. Others think it contained correspondence on alleged apparitions judged inauthentic. No scholar outside the Curia has verified its contents. The very absence of evidence fuels imagination, a perfect illustration of how secrecy creates myth. The tension between record and rumour is the archive's defining pulse. Still, some mysteries resist any classification, but the appetite for darkness persists. Scholars note that the archive's mystique survived precisely because it was never entirely opened. A study by the Pontifical Committee for Historical Sciences observed that partial transparency sustains interest better than full disclosure. Once everything is accessible, curiosity fades. While there are still closed boxes, imagination fills them with forbidden lore. In that sense, the Vatican did not merely keep secrets, it learned to manage fascination. Whenever a new batch of documents opens, newspapers rush to headline, Vatican admits X. Yet most revelations are less dramatic. Bureaucratic minutes, expense lists, mundane details that paradoxically make the Church more human. In 2006, when curators unveiled an exhibition called Lux in Arcana, visitors expected proof of conspiracies. They found, instead, the 1493 bull granting lands to Spain after Columbus. The scandal was history itself, not hidden sin. As you move deeper through this first corridor of facts, you begin to see the logic. The Church's archive is less a dungeon of suppression than a mirror of its own contradictions. Faith in order, fear of chaos. Each document carries two layers, the text itself and the decision to keep it. When an exorcism protocol was signed, when a dubious relic was withdrawn, when a folder was sealed pro prudentia superiorum, every act defined the border between belief and embarrassment. If the walls could speak, they would not shout scandal. They would whisper about caution, about centuries spent balancing revelation and restraint. And that whisper leads you to the next vault, where the origin of all this secrecy waits in the age of marble pontiffs and imperial intrigues, the moment when one pope decided that knowledge itself should belong to the throne. In 1587, Pope Sixtus V issued a bull reorganizing the Curia. Among its clauses lay a short, easily overlooked line authorizing the creation of a Archivum Secretum Pontificum. It was the first time in papal history that the documentation of centuries' letters, bulls, receipts, inquisitorial reports would be placed under a single administrative authority. The Latin word secretum meant personal or private, a term used in royal chanceries long before, but its resonance invited misunderstanding. The Pope's intention was centralization, not concealment, yet both ideas would forever fuse in the public mind. The story of how the Vatican decided to collect every secret under one roof begins not in darkness, but in paperwork. To understand why Sixtus V did it, you have to picture the Vatican of the Counter-Reformation, bureaucrats copying letters by candlelight, ambassadors negotiating with Spanish and French envoys, and an avalanche of correspondence threatening to drown the papal household. The Reformation had forced Rome to redefine control, not only of souls, but of information. By concentrating archives inside the apostolic palace, the Pope transformed fragments into continuity. Knowledge became sovereignty. Even the physical design of the rooms reflected hierarchy. The most sensitive shelves rose higher, accessible only by ladder and key. The message was unmistakable. Elevation equaled importance. The first custodian, Michel Lonigo, inventoried the scattered scrinia, literally boxes that held centuries of parchments. He arranged them in series that later scholars would recognize: Acta Camerari for finances, Acta Nunciaturae for diplomacy, Acta Congregationum for doctrinal matters. Each series told a story of how the papacy saw itself, an empire of order surrounded by chaos. By the mid-19th century, the political landscape had changed again. The papal states were shrinking, nationalism was rising, and historians in Europe began to demand access to the Vatican's immense trove. For centuries, only the Curia had consulted it. Now scholars wanted to test the Church's own narrative against its paperwork. The papacy resisted. Access, it argued, was a privilege, not a right. Yet pressure grew, particularly from German and French academics building the new discipline of historical criticism. When Napoleon invaded Italy in 1798, that secrecy nearly became its undoing. French soldiers carted off thousands of volumes to Paris as war booty. Among them were the proceedings of the Council of Trent, the papal registers of medieval England, and correspondence with Chinese missionaries. The effort to return them after 1815 became an act of reconstruction so vast that archivists still refer to it as the Second Founding. During those years, the modern idea of professional archiving, classification, description, access rules was born. Out of loss came method. Through the following centuries, new pontiffs expanded the principle. Urban VIII added the archives of the Holy Office. Clement XII ordered the inclusion of records from the Datary, the papal office handling benefices. By the 18th century, the secret archive was less a mysterious cellar than a functioning ministry of memory. The phrase Archivum Secretum Vaticanum appeared on seals, though few outside Rome knew what it meant. Those first researchers discovered a paradox. The secret label did not refer to forbidden content, but to administrative privacy, a secretum, as in the Pope's private correspondence. A curator explained it succinctly. Secretum non est arcanum, sed proprium. Still, the outside world clung to the darker interpretation, and perhaps the Vatican did little to correct it. A halo of mystery was useful. It transformed dusty shelves into an emblem of authority. From those days survive the first full inventories, careful Latin registers detailing shelf marks, page counts, and subject categories. They show that the Vatican never possessed a single monolithic archive, but a constellation of sub-collections inherited from various offices. Some of the oldest documents, papyrus letters of the 5th century, were already brittle. Others, like the fiscal ledgers of the Camerlengo, remained active files until the early 20th century. The term archive meant both tomb and tool. In 1881, under Pope Leo XIII, the lock finally turned. He opened the archive to qualified researchers, an unprecedented gesture for an absolute monarchy. His reasoning was as political as it was scholarly. By proving the Church had nothing to fear from history, he hoped to reconcile Rome with the modern world. The conditions of entry, however, revealed continuing caution. Applicants had to present academic credentials, letters of recommendation, and a list of the specific documents they wished to see before they knew what was inside. The archive was open, but only to those already trusted. The notion of partial disclosure soon turned into policy. When Italy unified in 1870 and seized papal territory, diplomatic tension threatened to isolate the Holy See. Allowing foreign historians into the archives became a subtle form of diplomacy, what modern scholars call soft power. Each visiting professor left Rome impressed by its hospitality and the efficiency of its record-keeping. The Church, in turn, gained ambassadors of goodwill. The practice continues. Every new pope faces the decision of how many additional decades to unseal. It is, as one curator joked, our slow-motion press release to history. Inside the Vatican, the structure of secrecy also evolved. By the early 20th century, the archive operated under a two-tier system, Open Series and Riservati. The latter included material concerning living persons or ongoing canon law cases. The distinction between confidential and secret blurred in practice, leading to debates that persist today. Scholars argue that such staged access, gradually releasing documents as time passes, has turned into a diplomatic instrument. The Church can pace revelations according to political climate, ensuring that the past never shocks faster than faith can absorb it. Historians studying these early inventories note something else, a deliberate mixture of sacred and mundane. Next to the registers of miracles appear tax accounts, beside theological treatises, receipts for marble restoration. This hybrid character preserved the Vatican's dual nature as both spiritual and temporal power. The archive became its most honest mirror. Throughout these centuries, one principle has never changed, the conviction that the Pope's papers belong to the papacy, not to any individual or nation. The archivists describe themselves as guardians, not owners. Every new deposit, from a handwritten note of John Paul II to a 12th century charter, enters the same continuum of custody. What began as Sixtus V's bureaucratic reform has become an unbroken chain of institutional memory stretching over 400 years. Another point of contention lies in cataloguing itself. Descriptions written by Vatican archivists inevitably reflect theological priorities. For example, a folder labelled Heretical Movements, Northern Europe, might contain both administrative letters and personal pleas for mercy. Critics claim that the language of description shapes interpretation, privileging institutional perspective over human drama. Defenders respond that neutral terminology preserves order amid chaos. The argument has never been settled, reminding us that even filing systems are acts of narrative. The archive's modern transformation accelerated after World War II, when electrical climate control and photography arrived. The introduction of microfilm in the 1950s allowed scholars to study copies abroad, though originals remained within the Leonine walls. A document could now be visible, yet still physically unreachable, a balance perfectly suited to the Vatican's philosophy of controlled openness. Later digitization projects continued that paradox, infinite replication under finite permission. And yet, despite its apparent stability, the archive remains a living organism, expanding, adapting, sometimes shedding skin. The renaming in 2019 to Archivum Apostolicum Vaticanum was meant to clarify that nothing secret in the sinister sense existed. Ironically, the change renewed public curiosity. Headlines proclaimed the Vatican Secret Archive no longer secret, as if a veil had been lifted. Inside, the archivists quietly kept working. The name on the door mattered less than the habits of caution behind it. As you leave the section of founding papal decrees and step toward the next hall, a thought follows you. The awareness that every empire of paper begins with a motive. From the outside, all this might seem a triumph of control. But if you read the correspondence between generations of keepers, letters preserved in the very rooms they describe, you sense an undertone of fragility. They worry about humidity, war, politics, interpretation. One custodian wrote in 1939, "We preserve the world's memory on dissolving parchment. Our duty is not silence, it is survival." That single line captures the essence of the archive's existence: secrecy as stewardship. For Sixtus V, it was power. For Leo XIII, it was legitimacy. And for modern Rome, it is credibility. The next chapter belongs to the forgers and the humanists who unmasked them. And just beyond the final shelf of the Foundation era waits a document that tested all three. A text once thought divine proof of imperial authority, later exposed as a masterpiece of fraud. The Vatican never officially condemned Valla, but neither did it thank him. His manuscript circulated quietly among scholars, and by the Reformation it had become ammunition. Luther would later call the Papal State a child of that lie. Inside the archive, copies of both the donation and Valla's refutation survive side by side, an institutional memory of self-correction. The forger's success had forced the Church to learn philology. When the donation entered the papal archives, it was treated as holy history. Copies were sent to Frankish courts, cited by canonists, and illuminated in golden script. Yet the truth behind the letters waited patiently for the invention of criticism. In 1440, a humanist from Valla, Lorenzo Valla, sat with the text and noticed what no theologian had dared to say. The Latin was wrong for Constantine's age. It used feudal terms unknown to the 4th century and grammar that belonged to the 8th. His treatise De Falso Credita et Emmentita, Constantini Donatione, dismantled the illusion. The empire of words was built on a linguistic impossibility. To understand how power can hide inside paper, you only have to read the parchment that once crowned emperors. In the 8th century, a document appeared in Rome claiming that Emperor Constantine, cured of leprosy by Pope Sylvester I, had granted the Bishop of Rome sovereignty over the Western Empire. For almost 700 years, this donation of Constantine was quoted as divine title deed, the reason popes could anoint kings, depose them, and claim lands from the Alps to Sicily. Every coronation in medieval Europe echoed its authority. The falsification itself remains anonymous. Most scholars place its origin in the court of Pope Stephen II, around 754, when the papacy sought Frankish protection against the Lombards. The timing fits the political need to legitimize the shift from Byzantine dependence to alliance with the new Carolingian kings. Whether composed by a monk of Saint Denis or by the Lateran Chancery, it worked. It turned gratitude into sovereignty. What made it last was less deceit than convenience. Everyone benefited from believing. The donation's endurance also reveals how archives can protect fiction as effectively as fact. In medieval catalogues, the text appears not under forgery, but under imperial privileges. When later popes ordered inventories, scribes copied those headings unchanged. It took the explosion of printing and Protestant polemic to shake that inertia. Even then, some curial theologians defended the spirit, if not the letter of the donation. arguing that divine providence had realized in history what the parchment only foretold. The line between myth and mandate blurred into theology. For historians, the case transformed the very meaning of evidence. Before valor, authority came from age and endorsement. Afterward, from analysis. The donation's collapse opened space for a new kind of power, the power to verify. Papal bureaucrats began to annotate older documents, noting variants, sources, and doubts. Margins became laboratories of skepticism. It was here, in the dusty quiet of the secret archive, that the habit of modern historical method took root. Within the archive today, scholars can trace how the exposure of one forgery led to a crusade against others. The 15th and 16th century registries include marginal notes, dubia, examinanda, non-authentica. This was the birth of internal criticism, a quiet revolution behind locked doors. The Vatican learned that preserving credibility required admitting doubt, and yet the same bureaucracy that labelled falsehoods also preserved them meticulously. Even lies deserved custody, for they too shaped history. The donation episode did more than rewrite canon law. It redrew Europe. When scholars in the Holy Roman Empire realized that papal temporal power lacked scriptural foundation, they pressed emperors to reclaim autonomy. Treatises on sovereignty by Nicholas of Cusa and later Jean Baudin all cite the controversy as precedent. Political authority must rest on verifiable right, not legend. Thus, from a forged charter in the papal vaults emerged the seed of modern secular governance. The paradox could not be deeper. Among the curiosities discovered in later centuries is a tiny slip of parchment inserted into one copy of the donation, preserved in the Vatican's codices Vat. Lat. 6075. The slip bears a marginal note dated 1533, Error Vetestatis, sed documentum necessarium, an error of antiquity, yet a necessary document. It captures the Church's reluctant wisdom. Some allusions are too entangled with history to discard. The archive kept the ghost because erasing it would erase part of itself. The forensic tools of Vala, grammar, vocabulary, historical context would be used again and again. In the 17th century, the same methods exposed a cluster of spurious decretals attributed to early popes. Each revelation slightly shifted the boundary between sacred and scholarly authority. By the time Benedict XIV reorganized the archives in the 18th century, a cautious balance existed. Admit forgery, affirm faith. The records became both shield and mirror, reflecting human fallibility inside divine administration. Yet, despite centuries of consensus, faint doubts persist around the complete story. A minority of historians propose that fragments of the donation might derive from genuine imperial decrees, later expanded by clerics. They point to stylistic seams and mixed vocabulary, suggesting multiple hands. The prevailing view dismisses this as wishful reconstruction, but the debate shows how even a proven forgery can continue generating inquiry. The archive in its silence accommodates both camps. It preserves the evidence and withholds judgment. The episode also left its mark on the way the Vatican trained its archivists. Manuals from the 19th century list examination of script, ink, and idiom as required disciplines. Paleography turned into a moral science. To guard truth was to recognize error. Even today, every student admitted to work in the Apostolic Archive must study the Regole per l'esame de l'escritura, false. Rules for the examination of false writings, first printed in 1883. The legacy of the donation still instructs those who file the papacy's papers. From a historian's perspective, the donation affair embodies the tension that defines the entire archive. It preserves both the instrument of domination and the tools of its dismantling. The same institution that once wielded a forged document as weapon later nurtured the discipline that exposed it. The serpent swallowed its tail and learned to live that way. By the 19th century, scholars working inside the reopened archive revisited the old case with new technology. Chemical ink analysis confirmed Vala's linguistic verdict. the parchment itself dated centuries after Constantine. These forensic confirmations closed the factual debate, but opened philosophical ones. Can an institution built on revelation admit that it was deceived and remain intact? The Vatican's answer has been pragmatic. Faith concerns salvation, documents concern history. The two may intersect, but they serve different masters. The afterlife of the forgery did not end with parchment. During the Renaissance, artists like Raphael and Giulio Romano painted scenes of Constantine kneeling before Sylvester on the walls of the Vatican's own halls. For visitors, the frescoes still narrate a fiction officially refuted half a millennium ago. The Church never removed them. Instead, labels now explain the symbolic meaning. In a sense, the Vatican turned its past error into pedagogy, a visible reminder that truth evolves. As you finish reading the files dedicated to the donation, one realization stands out. The archive is not a single narrative, but a palimpsest. Each generation rewrites the margins of the previous one. Forgers invent, critics dismantle, archivists preserve both. The papal shelves hold the anatomy of knowledge itself, error, correction, and memory intertwined. Still, curiosity lingers about internal reactions at the moment of exposure. Some letters in the Epistolarium Secretari Brevi 1460 to 1480 hint at clerical discomfort, references to resque non edantur, things not to be published. Whether these refer to Vala's findings or unrelated issues is uncertain. Archivists refuse speculation. The line between verified record and scholarly debate thus stays porous, a reminder that secrecy and interpretation forever dance within these walls. Beyond the last folder of the Constantine affair lies a different kind of darkness. It is no longer about empire, but about conscience. Records of trials where belief itself was weighed and measured, where fear wore legal robes and reason learned to whisper. The next corridor belongs to the tribunals that called themselves holy, the bureaucrats of sin who turned salvation into procedure. The oldest surviving manuals of procedure, like the Directorium Inquisitorum, compiled by Nicholas Eimerick in 1376, describe in precise Latin how an investigator should distinguish rumour from evidence. They specify how many witnesses are required, how confessions must be recorded, and how the accused should be questioned without violence, unless obstinate. It reads as cold rationality imposed upon fear. The book became a bestseller of control, copied for Dominican tribunals across Europe. In the archives collection, one can still trace marginalia written by later inquisitors, noting where local law differed from canon law, a bureaucracy learning to standardize sin. Inside the Vatican's silent labyrinth, one section smells faintly of smoke and iron, an echo of the centuries when judgment was written in flame. The Inquisition, often imagined as a theatre of horror, appears here instead as a machinery of paperwork. Its bureaucrats left behind thousands of folios, petitions, interrogations, receipts for chains, even expense lists for ink. The image of zeal and fire turns, under archival light, into columns of numbers and names. The documents reveal that the Inquisition was less monolithic than legend suggests. There was not one single tribunal, but a network of local officers, under varying degrees of Roman oversight. Some handled cases of sorcery, others of bigamy or heresy, whispered over tavern tables. When these officers reported to Rome, they sent summaries rather than full transcripts. The central registry preserved the paperwork that mattered most, the precedent, not the person. This explains why historians today find abundant procedural material, but few human stories. The system archived its logic, not its victims. Yet even this order conceals vast gaps. Historians searching for comprehensive statistics encounter silence, entire decades with missing registers, cities where tribunals existed but no records remain. Fire, war, and deliberate disposal all played roles. The French invasion of 1798 burned archives in Bologna and Ferrara. Others were dispersed during the secular confiscations of the 19th century. The Vatican itself admits that no global count of inquisitorial victims can ever be verified. The surviving fragments speak for a fraction of the whole. Among the verified remnants are the Libri Sententiarum sentence books from the 17th century, where each entry concludes with the formula abjuravit de levi or de vehementi, meaning he abjured lightly or vehemently. Punishment followed grammar. These volumes prove that the Inquisition possessed its own linguistic scale of guilt, one that could transform a theological nuance into years of imprisonment. The Vatican catalogued morality as if it were accounting. Among these fragments, correspondence between provincial inquisitors and the Holy Office shows both obedience and hesitation. Letters from Spain, Malta, and Venice often begin with deference to your eminence from the humble servant of the faith, but end with cautious questions, whether in this particular matter it may be prudent to delay execution until further instruction. Such phrasing reveals the anxiety of men caught between conscience. The Church demanded certainty, yet the evidence of sin was often ambiguous. In that tension lived the entire paradox of the Inquisition, faith seeking proof. Occasionally, the bureaucracy's humanity surfaces in unexpected places. A 1648 report describes a physician from Padua accused of superstitious remedies. After examination, the judges noted he cured more bodies than he endangered souls. The sentence was suspension, not imprisonment. Another file from Naples records a woman tried for confessing visions of saints. The final page states, "The matter to be discerned by spiritual director, not tribunal." Such lines soften the stereotype between dogma and mercy. There were moments of reason. A few files expose how geography shaped severity. In the Italian states, punishments leaned toward penance and exile. In Iberia, civil authorities converted spiritual verdicts into public spectacle. Rome's directives, preserved in the Acta Congregationis Sancti Officii, consistently warned against excess, emphasizing conversion over death. But local governors often ignored those cautions. This gap between instruction and execution illustrates why the Inquisition's reputation diverged from its written rules. The archive records the intentions, history remembers the flames. The Vatican's copies of these letters were bound chronologically, not thematically, which means that within a single volume, a case of blasphemy may sit beside one of witchcraft or moral misconduct. For researchers, the juxtaposition is striking. It shows a continuum of control, stretching from doctrinal error to private behavior. Heresy and scandal belong to the same ecosystem of surveillance. The archives capture not only theology but anthropology, the attempt to regulate human thought. Still, the overall architecture remained one of secrecy. The procedural manuals commanded that every session be summarized and sealed, with copies sent to Rome under wax. Witness names were replaced by initials. Financial ledgers identified payments to custodians rather than jailers. Secrecy protected both the accused and the institution, but it also erased context. By the time a case reached the papal shelves, it had become anonymous data. The archive turned lives into evidence. This bureaucratic habit explains why numbers of victims can never be reconstructed with certainty. What modern researchers possess are accounts of trials, not executions. The difference is immense. Many accused were reconciled, fined, or released. Yet because execution records often belong to civic rather than ecclesiastical authorities, cross-checking is almost impossible. The Vatican's holdings reveal the framework of power, not its final acts. What remains is the echo of procedure, an empire of forms. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when scholars finally gained partial access to these files, they discovered how incomplete the story was. Some tribunals, particularly those of Spain and Portugal, had already been transferred to national archives. Rome's own Central Inquisition evolved into the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, still custodian of the most sensitive documents. Permission to view post-1815 materials remains rare. As a result, modern historiography of the Inquisition is built upon fragments, an honest confession of ignorance preserved inside the very institution that once claimed certainty. This absence has drawn modern interest from digital historians. Projects using data modeling attempt to map connections between surviving inquisitorial cases, hoping to infer patterns lost to time. Ironically, the same technology that categorizes contemporary surveillance now reassembles its medieval ancestor. The archive, once the symbol of opaque authority, becomes a laboratory for transparency. Beyond statistics, the Inquisition's papers preserve a more intimate legacy, the evolution of conscience. In handwritten confessions, often dictated to notaries, the language of sin becomes the language of psychology. Accused individuals describe doubts, temptations, and dreams with startling honesty. These voices, frozen in formal Latin, mark the first appearance of interior life in official documents. What began as prosecution became inadvertent anthropology. Through control, the Church recorded the birth of self-examination. Among archivists, a recurring debate concerns whether destroyed records should be reconstructed through secondary sources. Some argue that oral testimonies, preserved in later canonization processes, can partially restore the human dimension. Others warn that doing so risks imposing narrative where none exists. The question reveals a larger issue. Can truth survive without complete documentation? The Vatican's own archivists often reply with humility. "We keep what providence allows to survive," one custodian said during a 2016 interview. Absence is also part of the record. When you close these folders, the silence of the reading room feels different. You realize that the Inquisition's archive is not simply a monument to cruelty or reason, but to endurance. It preserved its own contradictions with bureaucratic fidelity. Every seal broken by modern scholars opens not a chamber of horror, but a mirror of how societies manufacture certainty. The handwriting, neat and patient, belongs to people convinced they were defending truth. Their descendants now read those same lines to understand the cost of that conviction. The first century of printed ink had barely begun when three of the archive's most dramatic files converged into a single lesson: how scandal feeds faith and how secrecy shapes legend. The air changes here, the papers are heavier, the handwriting denser, the marginal notes less obedient. You can almost feel that the clerks who copied these pages understood they were touching dangerous material. And as you step away from the long tables of procedural Latin, another corridor unfolds, one filled with petitions for mercy and complaints about banned books, where control shifted from bodies to ideas. The flames would cool, but the urge to protect faith from ink would continue. Ahead lies the history of censorship itself, the lists of forbidden pages that once dictated what the world could read. This paradox defines the Vatican's relationship to scandal. The Chinon parchment did not exonerate the institution. It exposed its political calculus. Clement IV, cornered between Philip IV's armies and his conscience, chose to sacrifice the order publicly while forgiving it secretly. The document bears his verdict in the calm Latin of bureaucracy: absolvimus et restituimus ad communionum fidelium. We absolve and restore to the communion of the faithful. 6 months later, Jacques de Molay was burned in Paris. History remembers the pyre. The archive keeps the absolution. The file marked Templari 1308 opens with a list of names written in the same meticulous Gothic hand that drafted papal bulls. It records the interrogation of the last leaders of the Knights Templar, once defenders of the Holy Land, and later accused of heresy by the French crown. For centuries, these records were presumed lost, destroyed in the fires that consumed the order. Then in 2001, a researcher named Barbara Frale discovered a bundle of parchment misfiled among diplomatic correspondence, what is now called the Pergamene di Chinon. The sheets carry the lead seal of Pope Clement V, authentic beyond dispute. Their content startled even seasoned historians. They reveal that the Pope absolved the Templar leaders of heresy in private, even as public trials proceeded toward their execution. The discovery, published officially by the Vatican in 2007, turned rumour into record. It showed that the Church's own archive contained the evidence of a mercy it could never admit in time. A few shelves away lies another case, where knowledge and silence collided, the trial of Galileo Galilei. The file is larger than expected, not a single book, but a mosaic of minutes, testimonies, and the famous signed abjuration. Reading the pages in sequence reveals a drama stripped of mythology. Galileo was neither tortured nor imprisoned in a dungeon. He was interrogated by cardinals, some of them his friends, in rooms lit by Venetian windows. The records show that the charge was not disbelief in God, but obstinate adherence to the false opinion that the earth moves. When he recanted, he used words prepared by theologians: ego Galileus, abjuro, detestor et maledico. His signature is shaky, his ink fading at the edges. That tremor has carried centuries of moral weight. What fascinates scholars is not the verdict, but the paperwork that surrounds it. Marginal notes written by the notary Vincenzo Maculani include small corrections and underlinings, suggesting that even within the Holy Office there was uncertainty. Later, when Pope John Paul II convened the commission that rehabilitated Galileo in 1992, these same folios served as evidence of historical repentance. The Vatican thus used its own archives to absolve itself, a circular confession written in bureaucratic Latin. The adjoining dossier concerns another philosopher whose name became synonymous with fire, Giordano Bruno. His case file remains incomplete, its core transcripts missing. Only summaries survive, preserved in the Sommario del Processo Bruno 1592. They outline accusations of pantheism, denial of the Trinity, and belief in infinite worlds. The loss of the full record has generated endless speculation. Some believe the missing volumes were destroyed during Napoleon's seizure of 1798. Others suspect deliberate removal in later centuries to suppress details that would darken the Church's image. The Vatican denies any concealment, pointing out that the same gaps afflict many 17th century series, yet absence itself breeds mythology, and Bruno's missing testimony has become a vacuum filled by imagination. If Galileo's file shows restraint, and Bruno's shows loss, the fourth cluster in this corridor exposes the everyday face of fear. Letters about witchcraft. Hundreds arrived from rural dioceses between 1480 and 1650, describing women who fly at night, milk that turns to blood, storms raised by charms. The Vatican's replies are surprisingly pragmatic. Most advise bishops to seek natural explanations first, and to avoid hasty trials. One note from 1589 warns that the devil rejoices more in the unjust death of one innocent than in the escape of many guilty. The phrase anticipates the skepticism that centuries later would be praised as enlightenment, yet the tone also reveals an institution trying to contain hysteria that it had partly inspired. The archive does not confirm witch hunts ordered by Rome. It shows a headquarters struggling to moderate the zeal of its peripheries. Yet beneath the calm of catalogue numbers runs an undercurrent of debate. Were some files intentionally hidden to protect reputations? The question has haunted scholars for decades. Archival evidence suggests both accident and discretion. The Napoleonic theft scattered countless documents across Europe. Many were later sold to private collectors. At the same time, internal memoranda from the 19th century used the phrase ad maius bonum, for the greater good, to justify withholding certain materials from researchers. Whether that phrase concealed embarrassment or merely administrative caution remains unresolved. The Vatican's defense is consistent: preservation before publication. For historians, that policy embodies the tension between access and awe. Every scandal, every trial, every miracle or heresy eventually arrived in the same vaults, bound by the same red ribbons. That uniformity of treatment is itself revealing. For the Vatican, documentation was the antidote to chaos. Once an event was written down, it ceased to be unpredictable. Paper rendered passion manageable. the Chinon parchment, Galileo's recantation, Bruno's lost trial. They form a trilogy of the archive's dual role as witness and confessor. Hidden among these same years are less familiar stories, petitions from colonial priests in the Americas, describing miracles among indigenous converts. Some reports tell of healings and levitations, others of pagan trickery. A few bear the annotation, non credenda, meaning not to be believed. This small stamp tells volumes. The early church in the New World confronted wonders it could not classify. By filing them under disbelief, it archived the limits of its understanding. Still, the human dimension refuses to fade. Standing before Galileo's signature, or the faint wax seal that once bound the Templar absolution, one feels how belief and doubt can share the same surface. These artifacts speak in the dry language of officials, yet pulse with lives undone by their decisions. They remind us that the archive is not only a storehouse of faith, but of consequence. And somewhere in the silence between these dossiers lies an unwritten admission that secrecy can be a kind of penance. By keeping its most painful stories under custody rather than destruction, the Church performs a quiet act of contrition. It cannot undo the fires of 1314 or the humiliation of 1633, but it can let the evidence survive, guarded rather than erased. That endurance may be the truest form of repentance the archive can offer. Modern restorers treat these infamous files with the same neutrality given to any parchment. Ultraviolet scans, digital stitching, and carbon-14 dating have transformed relics of accusation into data. When the Pergamene di Chinon were displayed publicly in 2012, curators emphasized conservation over revelation. Visitors expected curses and conspiracies. They found delicate fibers and the patient labor of repair, the moral drama of centuries reduced, in the best sense, to preservation science. The procedures that govern a conclave come from a single constitutional text, Universi Dominici Gregis, refined across centuries, but tracing its lineage back to the reforms of Gregory X in 1274. He was the first to confine the cardinals inside locked chambers, until a new pope was chosen, giving birth to the word conclave, literally, with key. Later pontiffs added details, rations if voting dragged on too long, punishments for communication with the outside world, and formulas for destroying the ballots once counted. The archive preserves both the decrees and the revisions, pages of canon law written to manage suspense. Inside the Vatican's most private hall, the smell of beeswax and parchment gives way to the faint scent of old incense. Here, every slip of paper once determined who would wear the fisherman's ring. The archives of the papal elections, conclavia, reveal the quiet choreography of power that decided the future of Catholicism. On these pages, ambition is disguised as prayer. Beyond this hall of trials, the atmosphere changes once again. The next shelves hold volumes bound in crimson, each titled Conclave Acta or Scrutinia Pontificia, records of elections, ballots, and whispered alliances. Here the secrets concern not heresy but succession, not philosophers but popes. If the previous rooms revealed how the Church judged others, the next will show how it judges itself. Diaries kept by certain cardinals, preserved with discretion, illuminate what those rituals felt like from within. They speak of exhaustion, of arguments whispered between morning mass and the next scrutiny, of the strange intimacy that comes from being locked together under oath. Some pages contain sketches of floor plans or notes about meals, reminders that even sacred politics depends on mundane detail. These writings are technically private, yet the archive holds copies made after the author's deaths, permitted for historical instruction. The paradox of transparency through death recurs everywhere in Vatican preservation. In the oldest ledgers, the handwriting shifts with every generation, but the pattern is constant. Each election begins with oaths of secrecy. Every cardinal swears before God that he will never reveal how he or any other man voted. The copy of the oath, written in Latin on aged vellum, carries hundreds of signatures, some faded, others bold. The solemnity of those names makes visible what the faithful see only as smoke. Few institutions maintain such perfect ritual continuity. The documents record how ballots evolved from wooden tablets to printed slips, stamped with the seal, extra omnes, everyone out. The archivists note, with almost scientific curiosity, when cardinals began folding their votes 3 times, when the brazier for burning them was introduced, and when chemicals were added to produce white or black smoke. The mechanics of divine choice had to be demonstrably secure, a choreography of credibility. Historians approaching these volumes must sign declarations, promising not to reveal contemporary voting results. Still, patterns emerge. In several 19th century conclaves, diplomatic letters show that foreign ambassadors in Rome somehow predicted the outcome days before the final vote. Marginal annotations refer to lists circulating outside the Sistine Chapel, rumours perhaps, but corroborated by multiple sources. Scholars suspect discreet communication between cardinals and sympathetic envoys, a polite form of influence. The Vatican never confirms nor denies. Its commentaries focus instead on providence. Yet the very existence of those letters, now catalogued as Nuntiatuari Variorum Regnorum, suggests that secrecy has always been porous. Among the verified curiosities are the formulae for counting votes. The act of scrutiny was performed aloud. Each elector unfolded his ballot, read the chosen name, and placed it on a paten before sliding it into the chalice. 3 tellers tallied the names, then threaded the papers together with a needle through the word eligo. When a majority was reached, the ballots were burned. That ash, mixed with straw or wet hay to produce coloured smoke, was the only sign the outside world received. The first appearance of black or white smoke in official registers dates to the conclave of 1878. Before then, bells or torch signals had been used. The archive thus chronicles not only theology, but optics, the evolution of spectacle into symbol. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, the influence of monarchs is documented with striking candour. Letters from Spanish, French, and Austrian courts remind cardinals of ancient friendship and common defence of the faith. In a few cases, papal secretaries later annotated the same letters with the word impertinens, impertinent. The diplomacy of salvation could resemble the politics of any kingdom. Yet despite external pressure, the procedure's inner rhythm rarely faltered. When wars raged outside Rome, ballots still rustled inside the chapel. The archive also keeps minutes of reforms following moments of scandal. After the contested election of 1378, which triggered the Great Schism, new clauses forbade the presence of armed guards from any single nation. After the lightning-fast conclave of 1503, rules were introduced to require at least 2/3 majority, ensuring consensus. Each crisis became precedent, each precedent another paragraph in Universi Dominici Gregis. By reading these accumulative decrees, one senses the papacy slowly learning from its own secrecy. One particular manuscript draws scholars like a magnet, the Diarium Conclavis 1903. Within its pages appears the story of Emperor Franz Joseph's veto against Cardinal Rampolla, exercised through a representative just before voting. The veto, though once permitted, provoked outrage and was abolished thereafter. The diarium's calm Latin hides the tension of empire colliding with church. Its margins note the new rule. Any attempt at interference would henceforth incur automatic excommunication. Secrecy had become a shield for independence. Another enduring debate within archival studies concerns how much of these procedures should remain hidden once time has neutralized politics. The Vatican releases detailed summaries of older elections, but never the actual vote counts. The reasoning is theological as much as institutional. The Holy Spirit's choice cannot be audited. To publish numbers would reduce mystery to statistics. Critics argue that history demands full disclosure. Defenders reply that some silences are part of faith's grammar. The archive holds both conviction and restraint in uneasy coexistence. Because conclave acts are sealed, most public knowledge derives from unofficial memoirs written years later. The archive stores these under private testimonies, ensuring they remain accessible but controlled. Each manuscript begins with the same disclaimer: all herein expressed are recollections, not revelations. The distinction allows memory without betrayal, a delicate line that defines the Vatican's entire approach to history. The physical environment of a conclave has changed little. Diagrams preserved from 1621 show the arrangement of cells within the Sistine Chapel, each curtained cubicle labelled with the occupant's coat of arms. Later plans add plumbing, electric light, and telephones cut off from outside lines. Even modernization serves secrecy. A blueprint from 1978 includes the word Murus Electronicus, a radio-shielded wall. Technology becomes theology by other means. A quieter set of papers reveals the psychological dimension of selection. Letters written by cardinals to friends just before entering conclave show dread more than ambition. "Pray that I not be chosen," wrote one in 1903. Another begged to be remembered if the weight of the fisherman's ring should crush me. Their handwriting trembles between humility and fear. Reading them centuries later, the bureaucracy of holiness becomes suddenly human. Beyond these walls, in another series of crimson volumes, lies a different list altogether, the catalogue of forbidden authors, thinkers and books. If the conclave archives guard the mystery of who may lead the Church, those shelves reveal who was forbidden to question it. From the ashes of ballots we move to the ashes of manuscripts, the story of censorship written as carefully as election itself. Walking through the shelves of conclave documentation feels like listening to the heartbeat of the institution. Each envelope labelled scrutiny or ballot carries the echo of an older Latin truth: Ordo est servandus, order must be preserved. The Church's authority depends not only on doctrine, but on the perception of continuity. Even secrecy must appear consistent. The archives ensure that tomorrow's historians will find an unbroken chain of rules, each signed, dated, and archived, faith transcribed into bureaucracy. The deeper lesson hiding in these volumes is that election itself functions as ritualized secrecy. The faithful see smoke and a new name. The archive preserves the uncertainty, the compromises, the sighs of exhaustion that precede revelation. The process transforms human negotiation into divine decision, and the papers prove that this transformation requires choreography more than miracle. The next corridor smells of leather and smoke, for here are the ledgers that once dictated what the world could read. Between their covers lies the memory of a paradox, a church that collected every form of writing, yet forbade millions from reading it. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum was not merely a list of banned books, it was a mirror of anxiety. Every title entered in those pages reveals a fear about how words could rearrange faith. The index began officially in 1559, when Pope Paul IV ordered a master catalogue of corrupt and suspect writings. The Reformation had turned printing into a weapon. Rome responded with classification. The first edition, preserved in the archive's typographic collection, lists over 1,000 works from Luther and Calvin to Erasmus, Machiavelli, and anonymous pamphlets. Each line ends with a blunt formula, Danke corrigator, until corrected, or Omnino prohibitor, utterly forbidden. It was censorship systematized, a theology of ink. Successive popes refined the system. By 1564, the Tridentine Index introduced a new distinction between absolute prohibition and conditional reading. Scholars with ecclesiastical approval could study suspect texts to refute them. The Vatican thereby created an intellectual quarantine, contagion controlled through privilege. Archival records show that Jesuit universities applied for dispensations to consult heretical works. Permission was granted by the Holy Office under strict oath. The practice turned censorship into scholarship, an irony the Church acknowledged privately. Within the walls of the archive, copies of banned books were preserved, rather than destroyed. Catalogues from the 17th century list entire shelves, marked Libri Prohibiti ad Iusum Curiae. Marginal notes reveal that censors often read what they forbade, summarizing arguments before condemning them. One can still trace pencil marks in a copy of De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium beside the phrase, "The sun is the center." A censor's hand has written, "Incoherens cum scriptura sed utilize ad calculum." Incoherent with scripture, yet useful for calculation. The comment captures the uneasy coexistence of faith and observation that defined the age. From the perspective of historians, the index's bureaucracy rivals that of any modern ministry. Every provincial bishop had to submit annual reports of confiscations and local transgressions. These returns filled volumes titled Relationis Censorum, many still unopened since the 18th century. Their contents form a statistical portrait of fear. How many pamphlets seized, how many repentant printers, how many fines collected. Reading them, one realizes censorship was less about silencing ideas than managing circulation. The archive preserves the ledger of control. Outside Rome, however, the system took on unpredictable lives. In Catholic France, censors were often Enlightenment sympathizers who granted unofficial tolerance. In Spain, enforcement merged with the Inquisition, turning possession of a banned book into a moral offense. The Vatican watched these variations with alarm. Letters between the Congregation of the Index and Iberian inquisitors complained that too much zeal breeds scandal. Suppression, even of heresy, required moderation. That bureaucratic prudence, preserve order, avoid spectacle, echoes through every century of Vatican secrecy. Yet entire categories of literature remained untouchable: pornography, magic, political satire. When archivists today open those files, they find confiscated editions bound together like specimens, texts once hidden, now studied for topography and censorship marks. One volume from 1660 includes Il Decameron, Rabelais, and a Neapolitan almanac predicting papal deaths. Each bears the same crimson stamp, Expurgatus. The act of cleansing produced an archive of impurity. Among the most revealing documents are petitions from authors seeking removal from the list. Some offered revisions, others pleaded misunderstanding. Galileo's dialogue appears again here. In 1741, the Holy Office granted permission for a corrected edition, signalling partial rehabilitation long before the modern apology. A similar case surrounds Descartes' Meditations, where marginal annotations in the Vatican copy note errors of physics, not of doctrine. These gestures show an institution slowly learning to separate scientific from theological dissent. Not all prohibitions originated in Rome. Some were requested by monarchs, seeking to silence critics under the cloak of religion. A 1767 memorandum from the Spanish crown demanded the banning of pamphlets defending the expelled Jesuits. The Holy Office complied, listing the works as injurious to royal majesty. Scholars cite this as proof that the index sometimes served politics more than doctrine. The Vatican's own annotations describe such cases as external pressures, a polite admission of compromise. By the 19th century, the index had become both an embarrassment and a habit. While literacy expanded and secular universities thrived, the Church continued publishing new editions roughly every few decades. The list grew until it included over 4,000 titles, from Voltaire to Victor Hugo. The last edition appeared in 1948, its typewritten pages a fossil of the pre-digital age. In 1966, after the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI formally abolished the index, stating that moral responsibility now belonged to individual conscience. The decree was brief. Centuries of prohibition ended with a paragraph, but the archives remain as monument. Beyond the official lists, there existed shadow libraries, the private collections of cardinals who quietly loved what they condemned. After their deaths, many of those libraries entered the archive intact. Among them is the collection of Cardinal Albani, who owned a full set of Enlightenment encyclopedias, annotated approvingly. Scholars debate whether his indulgence was hypocrisy or foresight. Either way, the Vatican's shelves now hold the evidence of internal dissent, preserved through discretion. Inside the modern reading room, researchers can consult the acta indices, minutes of the meetings where decisions were made. The tone is rarely authoritarian. It reads more like a faculty debate. Cardinals quote Aristotle, psychologists, even novelists, weighing the dangers of fiction. Their reasoning often surprises. Les Miserables was condemned not for anti-clericalism, but for excessive sentimentality. Such justifications reveal censorship as an aesthetic, as well as theological project. The guardians of truth also guarded taste. The end of the index did not erase its spirit. Within the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, modern guidelines still warn against literature contrary to faith or morals. The language has softened, but the instinct endures, to guard meaning from distortion. Yet the archive's open shelves now host what it once suppressed, a tangible reconciliation between control and curiosity. Visitors often remark on the calmness of the place, as if centuries of condemnation had dissolved into quiet coexistence. Cultural historians studying the index emphasize its paradoxical effect. By banning books, the Church inadvertently advertised them. Printers in Protestant cities used prohibited in Rome as marketing. Smugglers along the Alps trafficked forbidden texts with papal stamps as proof of authenticity. The archive's confiscation reports mention seizures in Venice, where sellers offered Erasmus cum licentia with license, knowing the phrase increased demand. Censorship, like relics, generated its own commerce. Not every mystery of the index is resolved. Some titles listed have never been located. Others appear under pseudonyms no one has yet deciphered. Scholars still debate whether certain removals were deliberate or accidental. Entries missing in later editions without explanation. The Vatican attributes discrepancies to typographical error. Critics suspect quiet rehabilitation. These small uncertainties keep the field alive, turning bibliographic minutiae into detective work. Leaving the hall of censorship, you encounter a different kind of control, not over ideas, but over nations. The next wing of the archive houses the diplomatic files of the Holy See, the secret correspondence of popes and emissaries who negotiated with emperors and revolutionaries alike. If forbidden books reveal how the Vatican defended belief from words, these letters show how it defended itself from the world. In this silence, one perceives the deeper continuity linking all Vatican secrets. Whether the subject is heresy, science, or literature, the mechanism remains the same. Classify, evaluate, contain. Even prohibition becomes preservation. The index may have ended, but its records guarantee that nothing truly disappears. Each banned book survives twice, once in defiance, once in custody. The air changes once more in the next hall. Less incense, more parchment stamped with imperial crests and foreign seals. Here, the Vatican's voice moves beyond theology. This is the diplomatic heart of the Apostolic Archive, the correspondence between Rome and the world. The letters are small miracles of endurance, bearing the weight of alliances, betrayals, and faith dressed in statecraft. At the far end of the room lies the collection titled Syllabus Errorum, the Syllabus of Errors. Issued in 1864, under Pius XIII, it condemned 80 propositions of modernity, rationalism, liberalism, the separation of church and state. The text, bound in red leather and circulated through every diocese, was less a theological treatise than a diplomatic manifesto. It declared to the newly unified Italy and the modern world that Rome would not surrender its moral sovereignty. Letters preserved beside it reveal that European ambassadors understood the document not as doctrine but as politics. France's envoy called it the Papal Declaration of Independence. In those lines, faith turned into foreign policy. The archive holds earlier precursors of this strategy, treaties and concordats that shaped continents. The 1801 Concordat with Napoleon restored Catholicism in France after revolution. The 1855 Concordat with Austria balanced imperial control with papal dignity. These contracts, each signed Pius PP, are written in a mixture of Latin and the vernacular of their partners. an early form of international bilingualism. Every clause was a compromise: freedom of worship in exchange for recognition, property for peace. The Vatican never possessed armies, but through parchment it negotiated like an empire. By the late 19th century, the Holy See's diplomatic network spanned 5 continents. The archive preserves dispatches from nunciatures, papal embassies in Madrid, Vienna, and Buenos Aires. Each file contains reports written in looping script describing local politics, sometimes more detailed than government intelligence. These letters reveal the Church's second identity, a global observer disguised as pastor. Historians now view this correspondence as one of the most comprehensive chronicles of world events ever assembled. Its neutrality was strategic. Every regime, friend or foe, found Rome listening. Among the verified documents is a coded telegram dated 1914, sent hours after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It warns the Papal Secretary of State to prepare for grave continental disquiet. The phrasing, measured yet prophetic, captures the Vatican's diplomatic temperament: never panicked, always informed. Throughout the Great War, papal envoys sent reports on prisoner conditions, famine and morale, many later used by humanitarian agencies. These files show that while the papacy could not stop wars, it could document their conscience. The 20th century made that dual role, both invaluable and perilous. Under Pius XI, the 1929 Lateran Treaties with Mussolini resolved the Roman question, creating the Vatican city-state. The original copies of those agreements rest in a temperature-controlled case, signatures in purple ink, wax seals pressed deep. For historians, the document marks the Vatican's transformation from a besieged moral authority into a sovereign microstate. With sovereignty came the privileges of diplomacy and the burdens of neutrality. Inside folders labelled Concordata Variarum Gentium, one can trace the Vatican's negotiations with emerging nations. Concordats with Germany 1933, Portugal 1940, and Franco's Spain standardized church rights in education, marriage, and property. Each treaty mirrored the political context of its time. The German Reichs Concordat, signed months after Hitler's rise, remains one of the most debated of all. Archival minutes show that the Vatican viewed it as a legal shield for Catholics under a new regime, not an endorsement. Yet the ambiguity of diplomacy, silence mistaken for consent, haunts the interpretation. Scholars still argue whether the Holy See's insistence on formal agreement represented prudence or moral blindness. The archive holds the evidence, but refuses judgment. Equally complex are the documents surrounding the Vatican's so-called Ostpolitik of the 1960s and 1970s. This Eastern policy sought dialogue with communist governments to protect believers behind the Iron Curtain. The dispatches of Archbishop Agostino Casaroli, chief negotiator, detail meetings in Budapest, Prague, and Warsaw conducted in near secrecy. His reports balance caution with compassion. To speak with those who deny us is to keep our people alive. For decades, these files were classified. Only recently have portions been opened, confirming the quiet persistence of diplomacy where ideology forbade it. Critics accuse Casaroli of appeasement. Defenders see humanitarian realism. The debate remains unresolved, echoing the same moral geometry that shaped the concordats before it. Not all diplomatic papers concern politics. The archive also houses letters that changed the Church's internal course. One such exchange, between Pius X and the British envoy in 1907, discusses the spread of biblical modernism, a movement questioning literal interpretation of Scripture. The Pope calls it a contagion of thought requiring containment. The phrase would later appear in the encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis. Here diplomacy merges with doctrine, the suppression of ideas presented as an act of pastoral care. Another layer of the collection reveals a quieter network, unofficial correspondence. Scholars have identified private citizens who sent intelligence or pleas to Rome during crises. During World War II, Families of prisoners wrote directly to the Secretariat of State seeking information. Many letters bear the annotation Respondetur cum prece, answer with prayer. Others concern negotiations for humanitarian corridors, including the famous exchange between Pius XII's aides and German diplomats regarding deportations of Jews from Italy. The archive's recent opening of Pius XII's wartime papers in 2020 has begun to clarify details, evidence of assistance, but also of hesitation. The record demonstrates neither saint nor villain, only complexity. Historians now read those pages less as verdict than as mirror of impossible choices. Outside the political sphere, the same diplomatic machinery managed global missions. Files from the Congregatio de Propaganda Fide, now the Dicastery for Evangelization, contain reports from China, Africa, and Latin America. They show the papacy coordinating linguists, physicians, and teachers across cultures. Some of these correspondences contradict colonial stereotypes. Missionaries describing indigenous systems of governance with admiration, noting the wisdom of nations yet unbaptized. Others reveal ethnocentric assumptions impossible to excuse. The archive preserves both, refusing to simplify. A controversial set of documents, long rumoured and now partially accessible, concerns the Vatican's stance during Latin American dictatorships of the 1970s. Requests from families of the disappeared reached Rome through local nunciatures. Some were acknowledged, others filed without reply. The files demonstrate an institution struggling to balance diplomacy with compassion, legality with urgency. The Vatican's later cooperation with truth commissions in Argentina and Chile, verified in official communiques, represents a slow reckoning with that era's silence. The Church, once the custodian of secrecy, became a reluctant participant in disclosure. From the syllabus to Ostpolitik, the through line is unmistakable, a theology of negotiation. Every letter begins with invocation, in the Lord's peace, and ends with diplomacy. The archive's diplomatic section teaches that power for the Vatican was never measured in armies or money, but in correspondence. Each page carries the tone of eternity wrapped around the vocabulary of protocol. In the present day, digital cataloguing has begun to transform this massive correspondence into searchable data. Teams of archivists tag documents by location, subject, and date. Yet, access remains selective. Modern foreign ministries release files after 30 years, the Vatican traditionally after 75. That gap preserves mystery, but also ensures time for interpretation. History, within these walls, ripens before exposure. When you step back from these shelves, the sum of centuries of negotiation feels less like conspiracy than continuity. Every papal signature, from Pius IX to Francis, traces the same aspiration to remain at the table of nations, guiding without ruling. The letters of diplomats and popes are the Church's secular scripture, written in ink that never dries completely. Beyond the chamber of treaties another corridor opens. Here the tone changes again. The documents no longer concern kings or concordats, but human suffering. The war years when silence became accusation and archives became witnesses. The next pages will descend into one of the most contested chapters of Vatican memory, the papacy of Pius XII, and the long argument over what he did and what he failed to do, while the world burned. Among the millions of pages housed within the Apostolic Archive, few have provoked as much anticipation or controversy as the files bearing the name Pius PP. When the sealed cabinets finally opened in March 2020, historians approached them with reverence and suspicion in equal measure. For decades, this pontificate had occupied the intersection of holiness and accusation, praised for charity, condemned for silence. The documents, bound in pale blue folders, promised at last to speak. They begin quietly. The earliest letters of Eugenio Pacelli, before his election as Pope, reveal a man trained in diplomacy rather than rhetoric. His handwriting, precise and slanted, reflects the Secretariat of State he once led. As nuncio in Germany during the 1920s, he warned Rome of a new pagan nationalism. rising under the guise of order. These reports, preserved in the Acta Nuntiaturae Germaniae, show that he understood early what others would later call Nazism. Yet prophecy does not always equal power. When war came, his authority was moral, not military. Inside the Wartime series, the most striking material consists of requests for help, letters from Jewish families, bishops, and foreign diplomats, asking the Holy See to intervene. Many bear annotations in the margins, responditra, inquiritra, not tandem. These notes, written by papal aides, reveal an internal triage of conscience. Some appeals were forwarded to nunciatures for assistance. Others were marked impossible. The correspondence paints a picture of urgency, filtered through the machinery of caution. It is both bureaucratic and human. A verified example comes from the family of Professor Guido Mendes, a Roman Jew and former classmate of Pacelli. Their 1940 letter requesting visas to Switzerland elicited a handwritten note by the Pope himself. Aid discreetly. The Mendes family survived. Similar interventions, documented in archives of religious orders, confirm that priests and nuns hid refugees under instructions to act in charity without noise. These gestures, once rumoured, are now recorded facts. Yet the scale remains disputed, compassion measured in scattered case files rather than statistics. The controversy that has dominated post-war scholarship revolves around what Pius XII did not say. On Christmas Eve 1942, he delivered a radio address lamenting the hundreds of thousands who, without fault, sometimes only for reasons of nationality or race, are doomed to death or decline. To some listeners, the message was courageous, to others, evasive. The words Jew and Nazi never appeared. Historians continue to debate whether this reticence reflected prudence or paralysis. Supporters argue that an explicit condemnation would have provoked retaliation against Catholics in occupied territories. Critics counter that moral clarity was the Church's only weapon. The archive offers evidence for both interpretations, never resolving the question entirely. What emerges most vividly from the documents is the sense of constraint. Every decision had to balance secrecy, diplomacy, and faith. A memorandum dated October 1943 describes German troops entering the Roman ghetto. Beneath the typed report, a note reads, "Prepare shelter within the colleges, inform no one." Within hours, hundreds of Jews found refuge in monasteries and convents. The record verifies coordination between the Vatican and religious houses, yet the same files show despair that more could not be done. Pius's personal aide, Monsignor Dell'Acqua, wrote, "We cannot shout while others hold the guns." It is a sentence heavy with the weight of helpless virtue. Beyond the direct wartime correspondence lies an entire series labelled Caritas Operum, works of charity. These volumes contain receipts for shipments of food, medicine, and clothing sent to prisoners of war and refugees. Statistical summaries list millions of parcels distributed through neutral channels. Each shipment required negotiation with occupying powers, often via coded messages transmitted through the Red Cross. The paperwork may lack drama, but it demonstrates the papacy's logistical compassion. For every silent sermon, there was a train of supplies. Even so, silence itself remains the archive's loudest sound. Some scholars detect in the papal marginalia an almost mystical belief that words could do harm, that denunciation might destroy rather than save. Others see moral rationalization. The documents neither confirm nor absolve, they humanize. One of the most poignant items is a draft letter, never sent, Pacelli's handwritten notes for an appeal to the German bishops, urging them to remember the brothers marked for extinction. The page ends mid-sentence, the ink abruptly fading. Whether interrupted by caution or conviction, no one knows. When the war ended, the Holy See's role shifted from witness to refuge. Files from 1945 onward describe efforts to locate missing persons and reunite families. The Ufficio Informazioni Vaticano received over 10 million inquiries. Clerks typed responses day and night, producing what may have been the largest humanitarian correspondence of the century. Yet intertwined with these noble efforts are records that feed another controversy, the so-called rat lines, escape routes allegedly used by Nazi fugitives with clerical assistance. The archive holds fragmentary evidence, travel permits issued by church organizations under aliases, letters requesting protection for anti-communist refugees. Scholars disagree whether these actions stemmed from ignorance, sympathy, or Cold War politics. The Vatican acknowledges logistical aid to displaced persons, but denies organized complicity. The debate remains open, preserved in footnotes rather than verdicts. In the decades after the war, Pius XII's image hardened into myth or accusation, depending on the interpreter. The archive's gradual declassification from the 1960s onward, culminating in the full opening of 2020, has replaced ideology with detail. Among the new materials are thousands of letters from Jews saved by Catholic institutions, thanking the Pope for intervention. They coexist with reports from diplomats condemning his reserve. The truth lies not between these extremes, but within their coexistence. The documents show a pontiff navigating the moral geometry of catastrophe, a man whose caution saved some and disappointed many. What gives these pages their haunting power is their restraint. There are no exclamation marks, no emotional appeals, only the language of administration, to be examined, filed after response, no answer received. Yet behind these formulas lives the ache of an entire generation's conscience. Reading them, one senses that the archive itself has absorbed the trauma it records, turning sorrow into structure. Even after Pius's death in 1958, his legacy continued to shape papal policy. John XXIII, once his diplomat in Turkey, opened new humanitarian channels informed by wartime experience. Paul VI, his former aide, pursued dialogue with communists through the Ostpolitik files. Each successor read the same documents and drew different lessons. The archive, indifferent to verdicts, simply preserved the evidence for their reflection. In 2020, when the first historians entered the newly opened rooms, they described the atmosphere as reverent but heavy. Among the researchers was David Kurtzer, who noted that the collection's greatest revelation was not a single document, but the density of bureaucracy, a portrait of a pontificate governed by caution. That caution now stands as both accusation and defense. The papers confirm that Pius XII knew much, acted often, and spoke little, a triad that resists simplification. As you step away from the blue folders, the silence of the reading room seems deliberate. It is the same silence that once enveloped Rome under occupation, when church bells masked the sound of arrests. The archive does not tell readers how to judge, it forces them to listen. What endures is the recognition that moral action can be invisible, and moral failure eloquent. Beyond these wartime records, the next series of shelves glints with metallic bindings stamped Istituti Diocesani. The topic shifts from global war to internal reckoning, from crimes of omission to the management of sin within the Church itself. The coming documents will trace how the Vatican codified justice, secrecy, and accountability in its own courts, and how those systems too have struggled under the weight of history. Within the Vatican's modern shelves, parchment gives way to paper, and paper to carbon copies. The handwriting of saints has been replaced by the signatures of lawyers. Here, the archives no longer describe wars or heresies, but the inner courts of the Church, the quiet apparatus that judges its own. The atmosphere feels different, less monumental, more administrative, yet the same logic governs these files as governed the medieval ones: order through secrecy, correction through record. The system of ecclesiastical justice evolved slowly. For centuries, bishops exercised near total authority within their dioceses. Local cases of misconduct, whether moral or financial, were recorded in chanceries and rarely reached Rome. The early archives of the Sacra Congregatio Conciliae created after the Council of Trent, preserved the first standardized instructions on how bishops were to investigate priests accused of crimes or doctrinal error. Their language is both pastoral and procedural. Let charity precede punishment, but let scandal be prevented. The files reveal an institution learning to balance mercy with discipline, an equilibrium never easy to maintain. By the 19th century, as the Church expanded into continents newly evangelized, the need for coordination became pressing. The Vatican gathered reports from dioceses about internal trials, summarizing outcomes for reference. These summaries, bound in volumes labeled Corsi Criminalis Clericorum, form a legal encyclopedia of the Church's conscience. They include everything from embezzlement to heresy, from disputes over property to violations of celibacy. What unites them is the conviction that sin can be documented. Each case closes with a formula, remitted to the judgment of the ordinary, meaning the local bishop had the final word. The modern era introduced complexity. As civil law advanced, church tribunals were forced to redefine their jurisdiction. Files from the early 20th century show correspondence between bishops and the Holy Office about overlapping authority with secular courts. One letter from 1912 asks whether a priest accused of fraud should face canonical trial if he is already indicted by civil authorities. The reply, succinct and telling: the temporal sword suffices, but record the facts. The Vatican wanted history to remember even what it could not adjudicate. After World War II, canon law underwent a profound reform, culminating in the Codex Juris Canonici. The code codified centuries of jurisprudence into 1,052 canons, many concerning penal procedure. Drafts of this revision survive in the archive, covered in annotations by Latinists and bishops debating terminology. Words such as delict, crime, scandal, and abuse of office appear repeatedly. The tone is clinical, but the stakes are moral. The Church sought to reconcile justice with the sacramental character of the priesthood, punishment without desecration. One recurring challenge in these documents is confidentiality. The Vatican's system of secrecy, known as Pontifical Secret, was designed originally to protect victims, reputations, and ongoing investigations. Circular letters from the 1920s to the 1970s define what may and may not be disclosed. The rules are exacting. Evidence must remain in sealed archives, accessible only to the bishop and his chancellor. Witnesses are bound by oath, and transcripts must be copied by hand, never mechanically. The intention was to prevent gossip from compounding sin. Over time, however, the same rules fostered opacity. Scholars who study canon law today view this as a structural paradox. A legal system rooted in discretion inevitably invites misunderstanding. Some of the most frequently consulted modern files concern the revision of these secrecy norms. In 2001, under John Paul II, the Motu Proprio Sacramentorum Sanctitatis Tutela centralized the handling of the gravest crimes, delicta gravura, within the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The archive holds the Latin original and its explanatory notes, drafted under the supervision of Cardinal Ratzinger. The reform was meant to unify procedures and ensure consistency. For the first time, digital databases began to record canonical sentences. The move reflected an institutional admission that local archives alone could no longer manage the scale of cases emerging across continents. Yet the archive's role remained primarily custodial. Diocesan offices still generated the evidence, and only summaries or copies reached Rome. This distribution explains the unevenness of modern church records. Some dioceses preserved complete dossiers, others minimal correspondence. Vatican archivists speak of a mosaic of memory, where every piece must be contextualized before judgment. Researchers who consult these files describe the experience as both sobering and procedural, the story of conscience told through forms. A verified turning point came in December 2019, when Pope Francis abolished the Pontifical Secret in cases involving sexual abuse and related misconduct. the decree Rescriptum ex Audientia, now part of the archive's contemporary holdings, replaced absolute silence with confidentiality defined by civil cooperation. It authorized the sharing of information with secular authorities where required by law, and opened previously sealed records for internal review. The announcement marked the most significant transparency reform in modern Vatican history. Within months, instructions were sent to dioceses worldwide to reclassify archives according to the new norms. For historians, this shift redefines access. Secrecy, once theological, has become administrative. Still, full transparency remains elusive. Many files contain personal testimonies, protected by privacy law and moral duty. The Vatican's archivists describe their task as guarding the dignity of persons, even after death. To balance openness and respect, redaction protocols were developed, names concealed, dates generalized, but substance preserved. These anonymized records allow researchers to study systemic patterns without violating individual privacy. It is an imperfect compromise, yet it reflects a maturing understanding that truth and charity must coexist. The presence of these new reforms within centuries-old walls illustrates a continuity rarely visible from outside. The Church's instinct to document every action, even its own failures, creates the conditions for eventual self-correction. The very archives once accused of hiding have become instruments of accountability. When the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith began releasing statistical summaries in the early 2000s, archivists were among the first to compile them. The numbers, stripped of names, entered history without commentary. Documentation had turned confession into data. Beyond legal matters, these modern records also chart pastoral responses. Correspondence between bishops and Rome shows growing awareness of psychological care, prevention, and education. In 2011, the Congregation issued global guidelines, emphasizing the duty to report abuse and the need for safeguarding programs. The memoranda that prepared this circular preserved in the archive show debates about terminology, whether to speak of healing or rehabilitation, victim or survivor. Language itself became an act of penance. For historians, these evolving documents demonstrate the Church's slow movement from secrecy towards scrutiny. They reveal a bureaucracy learning humility through paperwork. Each reform, each letter, each procedural note contributes to a mosaic of repentance, expressed in administrative Latin. It is not the rhetoric of apology, but of amendment. Corrigator in posterum, let it be corrected in the future. When viewed beside medieval, inquisitorial records, the continuity is startling. Both epochs sought to defend faith through regulation. Both relied on written confession. The difference lies in purpose. Where the old tribunals punished deviation, the modern ones seek accountability. The archive, impartial witness, holds them side by side, a single institution watching itself evolve. As you leave the shelves of canonical decrees and recent reforms, the sensation is one of uneasy respect. The Church's legal history is neither pure nor static. It breathes, argues, and occasionally repents. And beyond this hall, the records widen again to the sphere of finance and politics, where divine mission meets temporal wealth. The next series awaits under the seal Institutum pro operibus religionis, the Vatican Bank, where morality and money intertwine in ledgers that few were meant to see. The corridors of the Vatican turn quieter here, though the papers weigh heavily with figures. Behind glass doors labelled Institutum pro operibus religionis, the Institute for Works of Religion, lies an archive that unites the spiritual and the financial. It is the record of a bank that was never meant to be called one. Its purpose, declared in 1942 by Pope Pius XII, was to manage charitable and religious funds, yet over time its ledgers began to mirror the complexities of the world it served. The founding statutes, preserved in the original Latin and Italian, are pragmatic. The Institute would hold assets for congregations, dioceses, and missions, investing them to ensure long-term support for the Church's works. Its managers were clergy advised by lay experts. Its location inside the Leonine walls guaranteed sovereignty from any nation's banking laws. Independence, the statutes claimed, was necessary for charity. In principle, the IOR was a moral treasury. In practice, isolation would become both its strength and its curse. The earliest financial reports show modest sums, wartime donations converted into gold and government bonds. After 1945, as Europe rebuilt, the Institute became a safe harbour for church properties in regions facing communism. Bishops from Eastern Europe transferred reserves to Rome, fearing confiscation. The secrecy that protected missionaries also attracted speculation. By the 1960s, the IOR's accounts reached into every continent, reflecting the global church it served. The system relied on discretion, deposits untraceable to individuals, but registered to religious orders or charitable foundations. The intent was security, not evasion, but perception would change with history. The first serious scrutiny came in the 1970s, when Italian magistrates investigated financial networks, linking the IOR to private bankers. Among them was Michele Sindona, a Sicilian financier who managed Vatican investments and later faced charges of fraud and mafia connections. The archive preserves correspondence between Sindona's companies and Vatican officials, letters written in the careful tone of business between worlds. They discuss currency transfers, exchange rates, and insurance, not crime. Yet when Sindona's empire collapsed in 1974, public opinion turned. The press spoke of God's banker, a phrase that transformed an accountant into myth. Within the Vatican, the response was defensive, but methodical. The Secretariat of State ordered internal audits, fragments of which remain in the archive's restricted section. The auditor's language is technical: excessive trust in intermediaries, lack of centralized oversight, no moral judgment, only diagnosis. These reports led to gradual reforms, record-keeping improvements, new supervisory councils, external advisors, but secrecy remained the institution's instinct. The balance between sovereignty and accountability proved fragile. The name that still casts the longest shadow is Roberto Calvi, president of the Banco Ambrosiano, who maintained extensive dealings with the IOR through the 1970s and early 1980s. The archive's records show loans guaranteed by Vatican letters of comfort, informal assurances rather than legal obligations. When Ambrosiano collapsed in 1982 with billions missing, investigators traced part of the money through offshore companies linked to church accounts. Calvi's death, found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London, sealed the story in tragedy. The Vatican denied wrongdoing, but agreed to a settlement with creditors, paying $240 million in recognition of moral involvement. The wording, crafted by diplomats, captured the ambiguity of responsibility without admitting guilt. For the Church, it was an act of closure. For historians, the beginning of a paper trail. Those who read the internal memoranda from that era see not conspiracy, but confusion. One note from a Vatican accountant, dated 1982, laments a world of finance moving faster than conscience. The phrase summarizes the crisis perfectly: a moral institution adapting to global capital's pace. The IOR had entered the modern economy with medieval tools: trust, secrecy, personal honor. The results were inevitable. Subsequent decades produced both reform and relapse. In the 1990s, new management introduced computerized systems and international consultants. The Institute began submitting to external audits, though results remained confidential. Its leadership emphasized charity as the core mission, yet the institution's myth outpaced its reality. Every rumor of hidden accounts or political intrigue found fertile ground in the gap between visibility and privacy. The archive's files from those years contain numerous press summaries and official rebuttals, a running dialogue between perception and documentation. A major turning point arrived in 2010 when Italian authorities temporarily froze IOR assets in an investigation concerning anti-money laundering regulations. No charges were filed, but the incident accelerated reform. In 2013, Pope Francis created the Financial Information Authority, placing the Vatican under international transparency standards. The new statutes, stored today in digital form within the archive, outline procedures for suspicious transaction reports and external inspections. For the first time, the Institute published annual financial statements on its website. The gesture transformed centuries of secrecy into cautious openness. Modern auditors describe the IOR as small by global standards, holding a few billion euros in assets, mostly for religious institutions. Yet its symbolic weight remains immense. The archive's recent reports document how internal culture shifted from discretion to compliance. Staff training manuals emphasize ethical investing, risk management, and cooperation with civil authorities. The transformation is quiet but real, recorded not in headlines but in minutes of meetings. What once operated on trust now functions through policy. Even amid reform, mystery lingers in the historical record. Some older transactions remain poorly documented due to lost paperwork or obsolete accounting practices. Scholars debate whether these gaps conceal wrongdoing or simply reflect the era's norms. The Vatican's own auditors call them zones of uncertainty. These phrases, neither confession nor denial, reflect an institutional habit of cautious speech inherited from centuries of diplomacy. In 2019, a new law consolidated financial oversight across the Vatican city-state. The same year saw the first public prosecution of officials accused of mismanagement, an event unprecedented in papal history. Although the trials concern recent decades, their roots lie in the legacy preserved within the archive, the slow recognition that moral credibility depends on financial clarity. The Institute's records now form the backbone of transparency, a reversal of purpose unimaginable to its founders. Reading these documents, one senses a larger rhythm repeating through the Vatican's story. Every era invents a mechanism to preserve purity. Tribunals, indexes, concordats, and each later reforms it when secrecy breeds suspicion. The IOR fits perfectly within that pattern. Born to protect charity, it became a lesson in accountability. Its archives chart the transformation of a medieval principle into a modern institution, one that now submits to the same scrutiny it once resisted. The ledgers themselves, bound in blue and stamped confidentially, are beautiful in their austerity. Rows of numbers replace prayers, but the intention feels similar, to make the invisible tangible. Each entry reflects faith translated into currency, a reminder that even holiness requires balance sheets. The Vatican's archivists, trained equally in history and finance, treat these volumes with the same reverence given to papal bulls. Their goal is not to glorify profit, but to preserve truth. In their quiet offices, balance becomes theology. As you leave this section, the air seems lighter, yet charged with irony. The same church that once managed empires through parchment now regulates credit transfers through compliance software. Its memory, however, remains ink on paper. Beyond the financial vaults lie rooms where the subject turns again from money to method, from ledgers to the architecture of knowledge itself. The next pages describe how archivists classify the past, the science of cataloguing secrets, and the philosophy of deciding what deserves to be remembered. Beyond the ledgers of faith and finance lies a quieter miracle, the preservation of time itself. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, often imagined as a vault of mysteries, is in truth a vast organism of paper, leather, and discipline. It is less a secret chamber than a living system, breathing in centuries of information and exhaling order. Inside these corridors, the past is not hidden, it is indexed. The organization of the archive follows a logic centuries in the making. Its core, established under Pope Paul V in 1612, united the records of the Apostolic Chamber, the Secretariat of State, and the Papal Curia into one centralized institution. The decision transformed private papal memory into public patrimony. The decree founding the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, literally the private Vatican archive, did not imply concealment, in Latin secretum, meant personal, reserved for the sovereign. Over time, the word would acquire shadows it never originally held. The archive's purpose was custody, not conspiracy. Every item received here follows a ritual of classification. New materials arrive from congregations, nunciatures, and diocesan officers once they exceed administrative use. Trained archivists, often priests with doctorates in history or paleography, inspect each document for authenticity, assign it a shelf mark, and enter it into the Registra Generalia. The notation is meticulous: series, subseries, volume, folio. In these codes, centuries of administration are translated into manageable fragments. Order is the archive's theology. Behind the scenes, preservation is as spiritual as scholarly. Temperature and humidity are maintained within narrow ranges. Ultraviolet light is filtered through screens. Leather bindings are treated with neutral wax to prevent decay. The laboratories employ chemists and microbiologists who specialize in ink composition and fungal control. They work in silence, their gestures deliberate. For them, each manuscript is a living patient. The restoration of a torn bull or charred letter can take months. Cleaning, flattening, rehydrating, and finally rebinding with Japanese tissue. These acts of repair resemble ritual absolution, each scar documented, never concealed. The digitization program, begun in the early 2000s, represents the latest stage of this vocation. High-resolution scanners capture manuscripts once too fragile for daily consultation. The process demands both precision and humility. Technicians must handle pages older than the printing press, turning them with gloved fingers no thicker than the parchment itself. Every scan is checked for color accuracy and metadata consistency before entering the Vatican's digital repository. To outsiders, digitization appears as technology. To archivists, it is translation, the transformation of matter into light. Access to these treasures follows rules, codified since Leo XIII opened the archive to scholars in 1881. His decision marked a turning point in the Church's relationship with history. By inviting researchers, he shifted the archive from instrument of governance to instrument of scholarship. The regulations that followed still apply. Applicants must present academic credentials, research proposals, and letters of recommendation. Once approved, they receive a pass granting access to designated rooms and catalogues. The procedure, bureaucratic yet ceremonial, symbolizes trust cautiously extended. Within the reading rooms, silence reigns. Laptops hum quietly where once inkpots stood. The catalogues themselves are works of art, handwritten indices stretching back to the 17th century. Their pages list popes, cardinals, ambassadors, and even the anonymous scribes who recorded them. Modern archivists are digitizing these guides, but the old ones remain irreplaceable. They contain marginal notes, cross-references, and corrections, traces of human judgment that algorithms cannot replicate. In the Vatican, even metadata has history. What distinguishes this archive from national ones is its scope. Because the papacy functioned for centuries as both spiritual and temporal power, its records encompass diplomacy, theology, economics, science, and art. A single shelf might contain a medieval papal bull beside an astronomical report from Jesuit observatories. Another might hold correspondence from missionaries in Japan or Ethiopia, filed next to Renaissance architectural plans. The result is not a collection, but a cosmos of paper, ordered yet infinite. Scholars often remark that the archive's greatest challenge is not secrecy, but abundance. Preservation policies reflect this dual identity as church and state. Documents are released chronologically, usually after 75 years. The rule balances confidentiality with scholarly access, allowing time for personal privacy and institutional context. The schedule is not arbitrary. It aligns with the average lifespan of those directly involved. To read the record of a pontificate, one must wait until its living witnesses have passed. In this, the Vatican practices an ethics of memory, history, as delayed revelation. Yet the process of declassification is far from mechanical. Before opening a new period, teams of archivists spend years reordering files, restoring damaged items, and verifying completeness. When Pope Francis announced the early opening of the Pius XII archives, preparations had taken more than a decade. Boxes were relabeled, indexes rewritten, and sensitive materials reviewed for privacy. The work required both scholarship and faith, for releasing history always risks reinterpreting it. As one archivist remarked, every unlocked cabinet is an act of courage. The philosophical foundation of this institution lies in its motto, Lux in Arcana, light in the archives. The phrase was chosen for the Archives 2012 exhibition, marking 400 years of existence. It encapsulates the paradox that secrecy and revelation are not opposites, but partners. To preserve truth, one must sometimes protect it from haste. The archive's duty is not to conceal, but to prepare knowledge for the moment when it can be understood. Among the most fascinating departments is the Archivio Fotografico, where images rather than words tell the story. Glass negatives record the early excavations beneath St. Peter's, aerial views of the Vatican City's construction in 1929, and portraits of popes through the evolution of photography. Each print carries annotations in Latin or Italian, noting exposure times and developers. The care given to light and shadow mirrors the theological language of illumination, the belief that divine and human memory share the same spectrum. Equally remarkable is the Archivio Sonoro, the sound archive preserving papal speeches, chants, and radio broadcasts. The earliest wax cylinders capture Leo XIII reciting the Ave Maria in 1903, the first known voice of a pope. Later reels include the wartime messages of Pius XII and the multilingual addresses of John Paul II. Archivists digitize these fragile media with the same devotion given to manuscripts, convinced that sound carries a spiritual imprint, no less sacred than ink. In their hands, history becomes audible. The human element remains at the heart of the institution. Every year, a small group of new archivists take oaths of confidentiality, pledging to serve truth without vanity. Their education is long: Latin, paleography, diplomatics, and archival science. They learn to read the texture of parchment as well as the grammar of theology. Many describe their vocation as contemplative, a monastic scholarship where silence replaces sermon. To walk these halls is to witness knowledge maintained by patience rather than power. In recent years, collaborations with universities and digital humanities centers have expanded the archive's accessibility. Projects like DigiVatLib now allow thousands of manuscripts to be viewed online, transforming what was once the most exclusive repository on Earth into a global classroom. Yet, paradoxically, the more accessible it becomes, the more reverence it inspires. Seeing medieval ink on a computer screen reminds users that preservation itself is a moral act, a dialogue between centuries. As you step away from these rooms of careful order, you realize that the archive is less a vault of secrets than a meditation on permanence. Every procedure, from cataloguing to restoration, arises from a single conviction that truth requires stewardship. Paper alone cannot save memory. Discipline must. And beyond this sanctuary of preservation lies another realm where the Church's intellectual heritage breathes through books rather than documents. The Vatican Library, twin sibling of the archive, whose story reveals how knowledge and faith have shared the same shelves for over 6 centuries. If the archive is the Vatican's memory, the library is its imagination. Entering its marble halls feels like stepping into the visible form of thought, a geometry of shelves and frescoes, built to remind the reader that knowledge itself can be sacred. The Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana stands beside the archive, but operates with a different heartbeat. Where the archive guards decisions, the library nurtures possibility. Its pages contain the minds of worlds that never met, except here. The library's origins stretch back to Nicholas V in the mid-15th century, a humanist pope who believed that faith should learn the languages of its critics. He envisioned a library for the use of scholars of all nations, commissioning Greek and Latin translations of ancient texts. The surviving Foundation inventory of 1451 lists just over 1,000 volumes, classics by Homer and Cicero, early church fathers, and newly recovered manuscripts from Byzantium. Many had arrived in Rome as refugees from the fall of Constantinople. 2 years later, their pages carrying the last breath of Greek learning into the West. The Vatican Library thus began as an act of rescue. Under Sixtus IV, the collection found its permanent home within the Apostolic Palace. The walls were frescoed with allegories of wisdom, and the desks arranged like choir stalls, reminding readers that study was a form of worship. The papal decree establishing the library in 1475 declared it for the common use of all who desire to study. It was one of the earliest public libraries in Europe, though public then meant scholars approved by the Curia. The reading rooms of the Renaissance echoed not with crowds but with quiet polyglot murmurs. The manuscripts themselves formed bridges between civilizations. Among the treasures is the Codex Vaticanus, a 4th century Greek Bible, regarded as one of the oldest surviving copies of Scripture. Nearby lie Arabic treatises on astronomy and medicine, translated by medieval monks from texts of Avicenna and Alhazen. In these pages, the line between theology and science dissolves. Both sought divine order in nature. Marginal notes in Latin, Greek, and Arabic often share the same page, a silent conversation across faiths. The library became the physical embodiment of that dialogue, where even disagreement was preserved as heritage. Renaissance humanists treated the Vatican Library as a laboratory. Lorenzo Valla, who exposed the forgery of the donation of Constantine, worked among these shelves comparing ancient Latin styles. Later, figures like Erasmus and Angelo Poliziano drew upon its manuscripts for their editions of the New Testament and classical poets. The printing press turned those discoveries into public knowledge, but the library remained the wellspring. Every page copied here multiplied across Europe, shaping the very language of modern scholarship. By the 17th century, the Vatican collection had become a global encyclopedia. Jesuit missions returned with manuscripts from China, India, and the Americas, grammars, botanical sketches, maps drawn in local scripts. The Sinica collection alone now spans more than 2,000 volumes, including Matteo Raoni's Chinese-Latin dictionary, one of the earliest linguistic bridges between East and West. Nearby, Ethiopian codices written in Ge'ez preserve Christian traditions older than Rome itself. The library's strength has never been uniformity, but curiosity, a theology of diversity bound in leather. The cataloguing of this vast inheritance became a science in its own right. During the 1620s, librarian Lucas Holstenius introduced systematic shelf numbers and subject divisions. Scripture, theology, jurisprudence, humanities, sciences. His successors refined the method into what archivists now call the Vatican Order, a classification by provenance rather than subject. Each collection retains the logic of its origin, papal, monastic, diplomatic, or missionary. This structure preserves context, reminding readers that every book is an artifact of intention. The Enlightenment posed new challenges. As secular universities rose, the Vatican Library sought relevance through scholarship rather than exclusivity. In 1741, Benedict XIV authorized publication of critical editions of its manuscripts, marking the transition from guardian to collaborator. The series Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana Codices Selecti began then and continues today, its volumes reaching libraries worldwide. The Vatican became both sanctuary and publisher, offering fragments of its past to the global present. 19th century upheavals tested this identity. When Italian troops entered Rome in 1870 and the Papal States fell, fears of confiscation spread, yet the new Italian government, recognizing the library's universal value, protected it by law. Scholars from every nation soon returned, often finding more freedom under papal administration than under political censorship elsewhere. The paradox endures. a religious institution becoming the custodian of secular heritage. Technological progress reshaped the library's work without altering its soul. In the early 20th century, photography allowed reproduction of fragile manuscripts for external study. The Vatican Photographic Service, established in 1926, pioneered microfilm preservation decades before digital scanning existed. This innovation not only protected originals, but democratized access. American and European universities received film copies, creating new centers of Vatican research far beyond Rome. Knowledge, once confined by walls, began to circulate through light. Among the library's modern treasures is the Borgia map, a richly illustrated world map from the late 15th century showing Africa and Asia before the discovery of the Americas. Its details reveal the merging of myth and measurement, sea monsters beside accurate coastlines, Eden located near the sources of the Nile. Scholars study it not for geography alone, but for its worldview, a reminder that exploration begins in imagination. The Vatican's preservation of such artifacts underscores that faith and curiosity were never strangers. Today, the library's digitization project continues that mission. Tens of thousands of manuscripts have been scanned at resolutions capable of capturing the fibers of parchment. Each image is accompanied by detailed metadata, scribe, script type, pigment analysis. The goal is universal access without physical risk. Yet even in this digital era, the Vatican insists that the original object retains spiritual weight. Scholars describe the tactile moment of turning an ancient page as an encounter with time itself, a sacrament of history. Beyond books, the library houses prints, coins and artworks that chart humanity's self-portraits. Raphael's sketches, Galileo's correspondence, Mozart's manuscripts, all coexist under frescoes painted by Malozzo da Forlì, where angels hold instruments of geometry. The message is clear: beauty and reason belong to the same divine order. For visitors, the harmony between architecture and intellect transforms study into contemplation. Silence here feels luminous. The librarians, known officially as Scriptorum Custodes, maintain traditions older than most nations. They still wear black robes and sign correspondence in Latin. Each morning begins with prayer, each cataloguing session with measured precision. Their vocation, they say, is not to interpret, but to preserve. To classify a manuscript is to offer it continuity, not conclusion. The humility of that task sustains the institution against the noise of speculation. In 2020, when the pandemic briefly closed the reading rooms, staff continued scanning manuscripts in isolation. The work never ceased. For them, conservation is not merely professional, but moral, a defense of memory against entropy. Their resilience echoes the library's founding belief that human knowledge, like faith, survives through care. When one exits these halls, the impression lingers that the library and the archive are two lungs of the same organism, the one breathing history inward, the other exhaling it outward. The Vatican's paradox becomes evident: secrecy and openness, doctrine and discovery, coexisting under frescoed ceilings. What began as a papal collection has become humanity's mirror. Yet beyond these scholarly sanctuaries, another chamber of the Vatican still whispers with rumour: the crypt of relics and archaeological layers beneath St. Peter's itself. There, history turns from ink to stone, and the question shifts from what the Church remembers to what it is built upon. Beneath the marble grandeur of St. Peter's Basilica lies a world that once breathed the air of the 1st century. Few realize that under the polished floors of pilgrims and cardinals, a city of the dead still extends in dim silence. The Vatican necropolis, uncovered during the 1940s, is the most tangible bridge between legend and evidence that the Vatican possesses, a place where the stones themselves speak of origins older than the empire's fall. The discovery began not from curiosity, but from necessity. In 1939, after the death of Pope Pius XI, engineers prepared a burial site directly beneath the main altar. While excavating, workers struck coloured walls. and tiled corridors, unlike anything known in Renaissance architecture. What emerged, layer by layer, was a Roman necropolis, remarkably preserved under centuries of construction. The Vatican halted all other projects and summoned archaeologists, among them Enrico Josi and Bruno Maria Apolongetti. Their first reports, now stored in the Archives Scavi di San Pietro collection, read with restrained astonishment tombs in situ, painted and inscribed, extending west to east beneath the basilica foundations. The Vatican had opened the earth and found its own past. Excavations continued discreetly through the war years. Workers advanced by candlelight through narrow passageways, documenting frescoes of pagan and Christian symbols intertwined, Mercury guiding souls beside the Chi-Rho, the shepherd with lamb beside mythological scenes. The juxtaposition revealed that the transition from Roman to Christian burial was not abrupt but gradual. Faith had spread first through families who mixed old and new iconographies on their walls. Each tomb became a dialogue of beliefs. At the heart of the necropolis, under the monumental baldachin of Bernini, archaeologists uncovered a complex of structures surrounding an ancient shrine. Above it rose the high altar of the modern basilica, aligning perfectly with a tradition that traced St. Peter's tomb to this spot. For centuries, pilgrims had venerated the site without physical proof. Now masonry and inscription offered material testimony. The central niche, lined in red plaster, bore Greek graffiti carved by early worshippers, Pater, Ini, interpreted as Peter is here. The modest letters, half erased by time, carried the weight of millennia of faith. The excavation journals record the care with which the team proceeded. Every brick was numbered, every layer photographed. The remains within were not immediately identified. The Vatican's policy emphasized caution. In 1950, Pope Pius XII announced the preliminary findings to the world, declaring that the tomb of the Apostle had been found in a manner which we judge convincing. The phrase was chosen deliberately, affirmation without finality. Historians note that this balance between certainty and reserve characterizes much of Vatican scholarship, belief framed by documentation. The story deepened in 1953 when archaeologist Margherita Guarducci re-examined the graffiti wall adjacent to the shrine. She observed that the bones originally interred within the niche had been removed to a nearby cavity during the construction of Constantine's 4th century basilica. Her analysis, supported by stratigraphic data and inscriptions, suggested that early Christians had taken pains to preserve Peter's remains while protecting them from desecration. In 1968, after years of study, Pope Paul VI confirmed that the bones discovered in that cavity had been identified in a way that we may hold to be convincing as those of the Apostle. They were placed in a transparent reliquary and reinterred with ceremony. The debate, however, did not end. Scholars continue to discuss the degree of certainty. The bones lack definitive anatomical evidence linking them to any individual known by name. Though radiocarbon analysis places them in the 1st century, critics argue that the identification rests on circumstantial alignment, location, reverence, and inscription. Supporters point to the archaeological coherence of the site and the unbroken tradition of veneration. The Vatican's own publications present both views, labeling them interpretations under study. In these words, faith and science coexist without resolution, much like the symbols painted on the necropolis walls. Beyond the question of Peter's remains, the excavations yielded extraordinary insight into early Christian Rome. Tomb frescoes depict the Good Shepherd, Jonah, and the whale, and banquet scenes reminiscent of pagan funerary feasts. Inscriptions written in Greek, Latin, and occasionally Hebrew show a community diverse yet unified by hope in resurrection. The Vatican's conservators continue to restore these paintings using microscopic pigments and fiber optic lighting, transforming the necropolis into a subterranean museum. Visitors today walk along a narrow path through humidity-controlled tunnels, their steps following those of the archaeologists who first revealed the tombs during wartime blackout. The discovery's theological impact was immense. For the faithful, it confirmed the continuity between the modern church and its earliest witness, For historians, it demonstrated the Vatican's willingness, rare at the time, to submit legend to archaeological scrutiny. The Scavi project set a precedent for scientific collaboration within an institution long stereotyped as secretive. Reports were shared with universities, technical drawings published, foreign experts invited. The balance between devotion and documentation that emerged then still defines Vatican research today. The archive preserves correspondence between the archaeologists and the popes who oversaw the work. Pius XII, cautious yet fascinated, requested daily updates written in Latin. One note from 1942 reads, "Continue carefully, the stones teach without words." Paul VI, decades later, expressed gratitude to Guarducci, calling her a servant of truth beneath the stones of the apostles. These lines reveal how deeply the excavation affected papal imagination, a reminder that history for the Church is not distant scholarship, but personal heritage. Modern technology continues to refine understanding of the site. Three-dimensional scans now map the necropolis in detail once impossible to achieve, allowing virtual reconstructions of its phases: pagan cemetery, Christian shrine, Constantinian basilica, Renaissance dome. The layered model reveals a vertical theology, the Church literally built upon its dead. For archaeologists, it exemplifies the principle that faith structures space as well as belief. The necropolis also forced the Vatican to confront the fragility of its foundations in a physical sense. Restoration engineers monitor humidity and structural stress to prevent damage from millions of visitors above. Sensors record minute shifts, translating devotion into data. The challenge is symbolic as well as technical: how to sustain the weight of centuries without collapse. The Vatican's approach mirrors its historical temperament: steady, cautious, perpetually balancing reverence with reform. Among the most moving artifacts found below the basilica are small terracotta lamps, inscribed with the word Petrus. Their soot marks show that pilgrims once left them burning near the Apostles' resting place, long before monumental architecture rose above. These fragile objects, displayed today in the Vatican museums, remind viewers that the Church began not with domes or frescoes, but with candles in darkness. The necropolis preserves that humility in stone. Walking through the dim corridors today, visitors pass walls that glow faintly under controlled light. Names of early Christians, Crescians, Linus, Agrippina, stand out in red paint against ochre plaster. They are voices of a city that still sleeps beneath the altar of the world's largest church. When you ascend again to the sunlight of the basilica, the shift feels almost metaphysical. The marble floor beneath your feet has been rebuilt 5 times, but the ground it covers has never ceased being holy. The Vatican's deepest secret turns out not to be hidden knowledge, but continuity, the physical thread binding the living and the dead. Beyond this archaeological threshold lies another realm of inquiry. Having looked downward into the origins of faith, the journey through the Vatican's hidden world now turns upward toward art itself, the centuries of paint, pigment, and creation that transformed theology into image. The next section leads into the studios of the papal palaces and the archives of the Sistine Chapel, where the brush became another form of prayer and the preservation of beauty another act of belief. To climb from the quiet necropolis to the painted vaults above is to rise from earth to vision. The Vatican's archives of art, drawings, contracts, letters, and restoration records reveal that the beauty filling these palaces was never spontaneous. It was designed, negotiated, and documented in ink long before it appeared in fresco. Every brushstroke here has a paper trail. The story begins in the late 15th century, when a succession of humanist popes turned Rome into a laboratory of sacred art. Nicholas V rebuilt the papal palace as a library of images. Sixtus IV, his nephew, commissioned the chapel that still bears his name. The contract for its decoration, preserved in the Archivio della Fabbrica di San Pietro, reads less like a spiritual manifesto than a construction brief: dimensions, pigments, payments. Yet its purpose was visionary: to create a room where theology could be seen. Artists such as Botticelli, Ghirlandaio and Perugino painted the first cycle of frescoes, aligning scenes from the life of Moses opposite those of Christ. Law and grace, prophecy and fulfillment, mirrored each other across the walls, the space taught through symmetry. Half a century later, Julius II inherited that chapel and sought to crown it with something unprecedented. His correspondence with Michelangelo Buonarroti, letters still crisp with iron gall ink, shows a relationship both adversarial and devoted. Julius demanded grandeur. Michelangelo demanded solitude. The artist's early complaints about scaffolding and plaster survive as marginal notes on delivery receipts. Too much dust, too little time. Yet by 1512, when the ceiling was unveiled, the Vatican's visual theology had entered a new dimension. The frescoes transformed Genesis into a sequence of monumental forms, human bodies rendered as cosmic architecture. The archive preserves the payment ledgers, 4 installments, totaling 3,000 ducats, and a receipt signed by Michelangelo himself, a reminder that even divine art required bookkeeping. Art historians study these documents to reconstruct process as much as intent. Sketches in the Gabinetto dei Disegni e Stampi reveal how Michelangelo revised his figures, enlarging God's hand, compressing Adam's gesture, adjusting scale until narrative became anatomy. Theological advisors debated the propriety of nudity in sacred space. Memoranda in the papal files record their objections and the artist's defense. The beauty of the body glorifies its maker. The compromise, later draperies added by Daniele da Volterra, remains visible today, half concealment, half revelation. The archive stores the papal order authorizing the alteration, an artifact of moral negotiation between art and doctrine. As the Renaissance matured, the papal patronage system evolved into a form of diplomacy. Artists were envoys of prestige. Raphael, summoned to paint the stanze, corresponded with envoys from Urbino and Florence, his letters filled with requests for pigments, assistance, and delays. One missive notes that lapis lazuli from Afghanistan arrived late, forcing him to postpone work on the disputer. The delay changed art history. The reordering of panels allowed him to refine perspective and iconography. In these letters, preserved under Raphael Practica, one senses how global trade and divine inspiration shared the same timetable. The Vatican's art archive also records the intellectual climate that produced such works. Meeting minutes of the Papal Accademia di San Luca reveal discussions on whether painters were craftsmen or philosophers. The popes sided with philosophy, elevating art to the level of theology. This decision had lasting consequences. It justified the Church's investment in visual grandeur as a legitimate form of teaching. The walls of Rome became catechisms in colour. Restoration records add a later chapter to this dialogue between beauty and belief. When Michelangelo's frescoes began to darken under soot and candle smoke, centuries of interventions followed. The first, in the 1560s, involved applying bread and wine to dissolve grime, a method both symbolic and disastrous. Each generation tried again with new materials, leaving layers of residue. The modern restoration, begun in 1980 and completed in 1994, was the most ambitious. The archive's Laboratorio di Restauro files include chemical analyses, color charts, and photographs documenting every square meter before and after cleaning. Critics feared that solvents would erase original shadows. Conservators argued they were revealing hidden light. The results stunned the world. Vibrant blues and oranges re-emerged, transforming public perception of Michelangelo from austere sculptor to exuberant colorist. The debate remains unresolved, yet the documentation stands as a triumph of transparency, proof that even the guardians of mystery can publish their methods. Beyond the Sistine Chapel, the Vatican's artistic records map a global network of commissions. The Fabbrica di San Pietro, the office overseeing construction of St. Peter's Basilica, kept meticulous ledgers of materials and labour. These note the delivery of Carrara marble, the wages of masons, and the engineering of the dome by Michelangelo's successor, Giacomo della Porta. The dome's completion in 1590 required 4.5 million bricks, each numbered. The accounting sheets read like a poem of logistics. Faith, measured in tonnage, rose toward heaven. Sculpture, too, left its paper traces. Bernini's contracts for the Cathedra Petri specified deadlines, costs, and even wax models to be approved by papal commission. His correspondence reveals a theatrical vision of devotion. Light shall serve as architecture. In the archive's lighting plans drafted by hand, shafts of illumination are calculated to coincide with the sun's angle on feast days. Theology became optics. Modern engineers consulting those diagrams during restoration have confirmed their precision. Bernini designed Revelation itself as mechanical choreography. The artistic papers also include moments of doubt and dissent. During the iconoclastic waves of the 17th century, some theologians questioned the abundance of imagery. Minutes from the Congregation of the Index record debates on whether excess beauty might distract from piety. The prevailing argument, endorsed by Cardinal Paleotti, was that sacred art educates emotion, it teaches by delight. The Vatican never fully resolved this tension, it institutionalized it. Every masterpiece here embodies that equilibrium between awe and instruction. In modern times, the art archive expanded to include photography, cinema, and conservation science. The Pontificia Commissione per i Beni Culturali oversees documentation of restoration sites, from catacomb frescoes to 20th century mosaics. Digital imaging now allows scholars to track pigment degradation and environmental stress. The Vatican's laboratories collaborate with universities worldwide, transforming secrecy into collaboration. Behind every famous painting stands a dossier of lab results, invoices, and curator notes, a bureaucratic testament to eternity. Among the more personal treasures preserved here are the papal letters to artists. John Paul II's Letter to Artists, 1999, appears alongside centuries of predecessors, forming a continuous dialogue between faith and creation. Its closing line echoes the same conviction that animated Nicholas V: beauty will save the world. For the Vatican, art remains theology by other means. Walking through the corridor where these papers rest, one feels the echo of brushes and chisels more than voices. The smell of pigments lingers faintly. The silence resembles that of a studio waiting for dawn. The documents teach that beauty was never accidental here. It was policy, diplomacy, and devotion interwoven. The Vatican's art is not simply decoration, but doctrine rendered visible, a visual archive of the soul's argument with itself. As you leave this realm of fresco and marble, another kind of artifact waits, the written words of the saints, mystics, and theologians, whose ideas shaped the images you have just imagined. Beyond the art archives lies the domain of thought itself, the theological manuscripts and forbidden philosophies that the Vatican preserved, even when it could not endorse them. There, the shelves of theology within the Vatican are not merely repositories of dogma, they are a record of questions the Church dared to ask itself. To read these manuscripts is to follow centuries of conversation between belief and doubt, where even heresy becomes a form of faith's reflection. The Vatican's preservation of these texts, some once condemned, others canonized, reveals an institution that understood early that memory, not agreement, secures identity. The story begins with the early fathers. Among the oldest codices stored in the Fondo Patristico are manuscripts of Augustine's Confessioners, Jerome's Vulgate, and Gregory the Great's Moralia. Their pages, written in uncial script on vellum, darkened by oil lamps, contain corrections made by medieval monks. Marginal notes in faded red ink reveal centuries of commentary, disagreements about translation, moral nuance, or the order of creation. These are not tidy texts, but living dialogues. The Vatican's choice to preserve variant readings, rather than impose a single version, already hinted at its archival philosophy, unity through diversity of record. By the 13th century, theology had become systematic. The library's scholastic manuscripts map the intellectual architecture of medieval Europe. Aquinas' Summa Theologica, Bonaventure's Itinerarium Mentis in Diem, and commentaries by lesser-known Dominican and Franciscan thinkers. The vellum smells faintly of dust and lime. The script alternates between tight scholastic precision and sudden illumination. These were not isolated works but classrooms on parchment, designed to train reasoning toward transcendence. Many volumes bear the stamp of the Studium Urbis, a papal university that evolved into the Gregorian. Here the Vatican's intellectual engine took form, a disciplined curiosity sanctified by order. Yet beside these monuments of orthodoxy lie texts once labelled dangerous. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, formally established in 1559, did not destroy forbidden books. It catalogued them. Copies of Galileo's Dialogo, Giordano Bruno's Dell'infinito universo e mondi, and Erasmus's Colloquia survive here precisely because they were forbidden. Their bindings are marked with red diagonal lines and catalogue numbers prefixed indine. The Church understood that to refute an idea, one must first keep it. Ironically, the archive censors became its best conservators. When the index was abolished in 1966, these once silenced volumes emerged as crucial witnesses to the history of freedom of thought. Among the most studied is Galileo's 1633 trial dossier. The file, bound in calfskin and labelled Sant'Uffizio Casa Galileo Galilei Florentinus, contains transcripts of his interrogations, the abjuration he signed, and private letters exchanged between cardinals. The handwriting is formal, the tone cautious. Reading it today, one senses not rage but anxiety, the fear of chaos, if the heavens themselves changed shape. When John Paul II ordered a re-examination of the case in 1979, historians turned to this very volume. Their findings led to the 1992 papal acknowledgement that Galileo's judges had erred. The same institution that once silenced him had preserved the evidence of its own misjudgment. Other intellectual battlegrounds echo through these shelves. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation debates survive here in parallel. Luther's early tracts confiscated and annotated by Catholic theologians, responses by Erasmus, Cajetan, and Bellarmine, arguing scripture, grace, and authority. Each page captures the shock of ideas colliding. The Vatican's retention of Protestant texts, even during centuries of hostility, underscores its archival pragmatism. To fight an argument, one must know it intimately. Modern scholars now study these manuscripts side by side, reconstructing not victory or defeat, but dialogue. Mysticism introduces another tone entirely, voices that sought truth, not through logic, but experience. The Fondo Spirituale holds writings of Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and lesser-known visionaries such as Catherine of Genoa and Maria Maddalena de Pazzi. Many of these manuscripts were copied by confessors who hesitated to publish them. Some remained hidden for centuries. Their language, passionate and ungoverned, often unsettled theologians accustomed to syllogisms. The archive preserves the correspondence between inquisitors debating their orthodoxy. One 1611 note describes Teresa's visions as ardent but obedient, an evaluation as poetic as judicial. These papers remind readers that within Catholicism, doubt and ecstasy have always shared the same roof. Philosophy entered this house of faith through the side door of translation. The Fondo Greco-Arabo preserves Latin versions of Aristotle, Averroes, and Avicenna, produced by medieval scholars in Toledo and Sicily. Their marginal glosses link Christian, Muslim, and Jewish thinkers in invisible dialogue. When Aquinas drew upon Avicenna's metaphysics or Maimonides' rationalism, he was reading these very translations. The manuscripts bear interlinear comments in Arabic and Latin, evidence of cooperation across confessional boundaries. The Vatican's role in preserving them defies the stereotype of isolation. Its scribes acted as custodians of the Mediterranean mind. During the Enlightenment, the tone of theology shifted from commentary to critique. The library's Fondo Moderno includes first editions of Descartes, Pascal, and Kant, each annotated by ecclesiastical reviewers. Some annotations are approving, others alarmed. On the margin of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, a Vatican reader wrote, "He measures mystery by logic, dangerous but sincere." The remark could serve as a summary of modernity itself. These notes reveal not censorship but engagement. The Church read its challengers closely even when it disagreed. In the 20th century, new forms of thought entered the collection: existentialism, phenomenology, social doctrine. The archives of the Second Vatican Council, now partially digitized, record debates that shaped modern Catholicism: the nature of revelation, religious freedom, the role of science. Drafts of Die Verbum and Gaudium et Spes show handwritten amendments by bishops from every continent, transforming Latin formulations into global voices. The papers illustrate theology's democratization. For the first time, the Universal Church wrote itself. These documents, humble in appearance, mark the shift from fortress to forum. Equally revealing are the records of re-evaluated thinkers, once viewed with suspicion. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's works, long restricted, now sit alongside Thomistic treatises, their evolutionist mysticism no longer heresy but inquiry. The archive maintains both the 1962 notification that silenced him and the later correspondence acknowledging his contribution to dialogue between science and faith. The two documents placed side by side form a miniature history of institutional self-correction. The Vatican's handling of these manuscripts reflects a subtle understanding of time. Ideas too bold for one century may mature in another. Preservation ensures that no voice, however contentious, is lost to forgetting. The archivists themselves describe their task as servire veritati in tempore, to serve truth in time. Their neutrality is deliberate. Judgment belongs to history, not to them. In their orderliness lies an ethic, a faith in continuity beyond comprehension. Standing among these volumes, one senses that theology here is not a closed system but a landscape, valleys of certainty and mountains of speculation. The archive contains contradictions without needing to resolve them. Each manuscript whispers that truth, like light, through stained glass, reveals itself in fragments. The Vatican, often accused of hiding, in reality preserves those fragments with obsessive care. As you leave this chamber of thought, the air feels denser with ink than with dust. The questions lingering here about creation, freedom, and the nature of reason do not conclude, they echo. Yet outside these shelves, another kind of record awaits, one written not by theologians, but by statesmen and diplomats. The next section turns to the 20th century archives of concord and conflict, the documents through which the Vatican navigated 2 world wars, Cold War politics, and the moral challenges of global peace. The oldest archive in the world has entered the newest age of memory. In rooms once filled with parchment and dust, the hum of servers now replaces the creak of binding leather. The Vatican's digital transformation is not a rupture with its past, but its latest preservation strategy, a new chapter in the Church's dialogue between secrecy and revelation. The process began quietly in the late 20th century. By then, centuries of handling had begun to wear even the most resilient manuscripts. Conservators realized that physical restoration alone could not protect everything. Light, humidity, and human touch, each a threat multiplied by access, demanded a new medium. The Vatican Library launched its first microfilm project in the 1950s, partnering with American and European universities to create photographic copies of ancient texts. Millions of frames were stored in subterranean vaults near Lake Geneva and at St. Louis University, ensuring duplication even in case of disaster. This was the first digital age in embryo, information rendered in light rather than ink. True digitization began in the 1990s as scanners replaced cameras. A pilot project, funded by the Library of Congress, digitized portions of the Palatine and Urbino collections, using custom-built cradles to hold fragile manuscripts at a 120-degree angle to prevent spine damage. Each scan was catalogued in Latin metadata, preserving the cataloging traditions of the 17th century, while adapting them to XML and later MARC standards. The irony was not lost on the staff. The oldest classification codes on Earth now lived inside the newest. By the early 2000s, the Vatican's DigiVatlib initiative had become one of the largest cultural digitization programs in Europe. IBM supplied servers. Japanese imaging companies provided high-resolution cameras capable of capturing pigment details at 600 dpi. The project's first milestone, 15,000 manuscripts online, was celebrated not with ceremony, but with a silent upload. For the first time, scholars in Buenos Aires or Seoul could study the same folios once accessible only to a handful of experts in Rome. The library's director described the event simply, "We have opened a window without unlocking a door." The Apostolic Archive followed, though with stricter boundaries. Its digital catalogue remains internal, accessible only to registered researchers, yet its infrastructure rivals national intelligence systems in complexity. Documents are scanned using multispectral imaging that reveals erased text invisible to the naked eye, palimpsests where lost centuries reappear as faint light. The resulting files are stored on encrypted servers inside the Vatican city-state and mirrored in undisclosed locations abroad. Preservation now depends as much on cybersecurity as on climate control. For an institution built on secrecy, this transition required theological reflection as much as technical skill. Archivists debated whether virtual copies diminished the aura of sacred objects. Could a pixel possess the same sanctity as parchment written by a saint? The consensus that emerged was pragmatic. Fidelity of image served fidelity of truth. The medium mattered less than the message's survival. One archivist summarized the philosophy in Latin shorthand, imago servitio veritatis, the image in service of truth. Partnerships expanded the effort beyond Vatican walls. In 2014, the Holy See signed an agreement with the Bodleian Library and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France to digitize Hebrew and Greek biblical manuscripts held across all three institutions. The aim was universal access to the foundational texts of Western monotheism. These collaborations produced not only images but metadata harmonization, a shared digital language linking scrolls separated by centuries and geography. In this new ecumenism of data, theology met computer science. Yet the shift raised questions of control. How could the Vatican maintain authenticity in a world of infinite replication? To address this, technicians developed a digital watermark incorporating invisible patterns tied to the Vatican's coat of arms. Each image carries a traceable signature, ensuring provenance even if files circulate freely. In effect, the papal seal has migrated into binary code. The gesture symbolizes continuity, authority adapting to transparency. The ethics of access remains central to this transformation. Not every document can or should be released online. Records involving personal correspondence, confessions, or sensitive political negotiations still fall under moral privacy. Vatican policy now distinguishes between openness and exposure. To be accessible is not to be unguarded. This philosophy echoes the same prudence that guided papal diplomacy. Disclosure must serve understanding, not curiosity. For digital archivists, this balance is maintained by metadata hierarchies, layers of visibility controlling who can see what and when. The design resembles theology itself, revelation in stages. Technical preservation introduces its own theology of time. Hard drives decay faster than parchment, file formats become obsolete. To prevent digital extinction, the Vatican's Information Technology Center established a migration calendar, reviewing storage media every 5 years. Data are periodically transferred to new systems, ensuring perpetual readability. Each transfer generates an audit trail signed by both archivist and engineer, a modern counterpart to medieval scribes initialing their copies. The principle is identical: continuity through vigilance. Cybersecurity has become a spiritual duty. In recent years, the Vatican has faced attempted intrusions by hackers seeking political or financial information. None succeeded, but the incidents spurred further reinforcement. Firewalls now guard not only data, but identity. The Vatican's digital defences, overseen by a multinational team of lay experts and clergy, mirror its global mission: unity through diversity, vigilance through cooperation. The archivists sometimes joke that the new custodians of the keys are programmers. Digitization has also changed scholarship itself. Machine learning algorithms can now transcribe cursive Latin, cluster handwriting styles, and even predict scribal origins. Researchers use artificial intelligence to compare thousands of documents once unreadable due to damage or faded ink. The Vatican collaborates with universities in Rome, Munich, and Stanford on neural network models trained on its own manuscripts. For the first time, the machine participates in exegesis. The paradox delights theologians, an artificial mind helping preserve the divine word. Public engagement has grown alongside technology. Virtual exhibitions like Lux in Arcana Online allow visitors to explore 3D models of papal seals, letters from Michelangelo, or the treaties of Westphalia. The digital environment recreates the reverence of the reading room while multiplying its reach. Each click becomes an act of pilgrimage. The Vatican's oldest instinct, to teach through presence, now operates through screens. Still, beneath the enthusiasm lies caution. Archivists worry that abundance may dilute awe. The experience of encountering an original, its texture, smell, and scale, cannot be reproduced. They insist that digitization is conservation, not replacement. The real manuscripts remain guarded in climate-controlled silence, their digital twins ambassadors rather than heirs. In this coexistence between matter and image, the Vatican enacts its oldest lesson: faith in what is unseen, trust in what endures. The transformation continues. Plans for a dedicated Vatican data center are underway, combining cloud storage with on-site preservation. The project's codename Arca evokes the Ark, a vessel for safeguarding covenantal memory. The metaphor fits perfectly. For an institution defined by continuity, technology is not revolution, but new stewardship. The archive that once guarded empires now guards humanity's data. As you leave this electronic sanctum, the hum of servers fades into the silence of the old corridors. The scent of parchment mingles with ozone from cooled machines. The Vatican's memory has learned to inhabit both flesh and light. Beyond these rooms, another dimension of its heritage awaits: the music, rituals, and spoken word through which centuries of belief found sound. The next section follows that resonance: how the Vatican preserved not only texts but voices, turning faith itself into sound that still reverberates across time. If the written word preserves faith in silence, music preserves it in breath. Within the Vatican, archives of sound lie beside those of parchment, testifying that belief has always been spoken and sung before it was written. The Vatican's phonographic and musical collections reveal a civilization that learned early to translate theology into vibration. To listen here is to hear centuries resonating together: monks and microphones, parchment and vinyl, psalms and radio waves. The story begins long before recording technology. Gregorian chant, codified under Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century, was the Church's first universal language. Its notations, neumes floating above Latin syllables, form the oldest system of musical writing still in use. The Vatican's Antiphonarium Romanum, a 12th century manuscript bound in goat leather, preserves the standardized repertoire of psalms sung across medieval Christendom. Each melody, monophonic and unhurried, was designed to mirror speech itself, turning scripture into measured breath. To preserve these chants was to preserve memory. Each monastery became a recording studio of ink and devotion. The Archivio della Cappella Sistina, founded in 1471, institutionalized this musical heritage. Its shelves contain thousands of handwritten scores from Renaissance masters Josquin des Prez, Palestrina, Allegri, The last name is inseparable from mystery. For centuries, the Miserere by Gregorio Allegri was performed only within the Sistine Chapel during Holy Week. Copying or performing it elsewhere incurred excommunication. Yet in 1770, a 14-year-old Mozart visited Rome, listened twice, and wrote the entire piece from memory. His manuscript, preserved in the Vatican Library beside the original, represents both transgression and tribute. The episode illustrates how secrecy itself helped immortalize the sound. By the 17th century, the Sistine Chapel Choir had become the model for liturgical music worldwide. The archive's choir books reveal precise instructions on tone and tempo, annotated by choir directors in neat Italian script, adagio maestoso con pietà. These notations, replicated across centuries, trained singers not only in pitch but in attitude. For the Vatican, music was theology through discipline. A well-sung Kyrie was considered a form of doctrinal clarity. The age of recording transformed this oral continuity into oral permanence. In 1903, technicians from the gramophone and typewriter company arrived in Rome to capture the voice of Leo XIII on wax cylinders. The Pope's frail chant of the Ave Maria lasted less than 2 minutes, but marked the first time the human voice of a pontiff had been preserved. The cylinders, now stored in a climate-controlled cabinet at the Archivio Sonoro Vaticano, remain audible proof that modernity had entered the papal voice. The recording crackles with age, yet within it one hears a continuity unbroken since Gregory, prayer becoming sound. Decades later, the Vatican embraced radio with similar pragmatism. In 1931, Guglielmo Marconi installed transmitters within Vatican City, and Pius XI's inaugural broadcast declared, "May this voice reach all peoples and proclaim peace." The event marked the birth of Radio Vaticana, an institution that would become the Church's global ear and tongue. The archives preserve original scripts, transmission logs, and technical diagrams drafted by Jesuit engineers. During World War II, the radio transmitted over 1 million messages from prisoners of war to their families, using coded phrases dictated by humanitarian law. Each message began with the Latin phrase, in nomine Domini, a benediction disguised as protocol. After the war, Radio Vaticana evolved into a multilingual broadcaster, reaching every continent. Recordings in Latin, Italian, French, Swahili, and Mandarin testify to the universality of its mission. The Vatican's sonic archives now span over 800,000 hours of audio, preserved on magnetic tape, digital reels, and cloud servers. Cataloguers log not only content, but tone, homilies, symphonies, field recordings of pilgrim songs. Their work reflects a conviction that sound, like text, requires taxonomy. In the language of preservation, a chant and a broadcast share the same dignity. Parallel to the radio's expansion, the Pontifical Institute of Sacred Music, established in 1910, became the Church's academic guardian of sound. Its archives contain ethnographic recordings of liturgical chants from Africa, Asia, and the Americas, proof that Catholic music evolved not by imitation, but by absorption. These recordings, made on wax discs and reel-to-reel tapes, document the adaptation of Latin hymns into local rhythms. The Institute's scholars describe this as inculturation through melody, faith expressed through regional soundscapes. The Vatican's acceptance of these variations marks a quiet revolution, the globalization of Gregorian spirit. Restoration of aging audio has become a science as meticulous as manuscript repair. Engineers at the Vatican's Laboratorio Sonoro digitize fragile tapes, removing background hiss and correcting pitch drift. Each step is logged in bilingual reports, Latin for tradition, English for technology. The process mirrors theological restoration, purifying noise without altering essence. When the project began in 1998, archivists discovered that magnetic tapes from the 1940s had begun to flake. Emergency freezing preserved them until digitization could proceed. These rescued sounds, now stored as 96 kHz high-definition files, ensure that the 20th century's voice will not vanish like dust. The Vatican's archives of chant and speech also reveal how music and language evolved together. Latin, though no longer the vernacular, survives through melody. The Schola Cantorum continues to train singers in pronunciation according to Roman tradition, softer consonants, open vowels, syllables shaped by acoustics of marble spaces. Recordings of papal liturgies from Pius XII to Francis demonstrate subtle shifts, slower tempos in earlier decades, more inclusive phrasing in modern homilies. Each change reflects theology's rhythm, adjusting to humanity's pulse. Not all sonic records belong to solemn ritual. The archives preserve the laughter of John III greeting children, the weary pauses in Paul VI's address after the death of Aldo Moro, the fervour of John Paul II speaking in his native Polish to crowds in Krakow. These voices remind listeners that the papacy, for all its grandeur, remains a human office conducted through breath. Hearing them, scholars sense history, transforming from event to encounter. A document can be read, a voice can only be experienced. Modern technology extends this intimacy further. In 2015, the Vatican collaborated with Deutsche Grammophon to release Cantat Domino, the first studio recording made inside the Sistine Chapel. The album's cover notes explain that digital microphones captured frequencies inaudible to the human ear, preserving acoustics otherwise lost in transmission. The release reached millions online, transforming the chapel, once reserved for conclaves, into a virtual concert hall. The paradox is perfect, secrecy generating universality. Today, the Vatican's digital sound archives are part of the same infrastructure that houses its manuscripts. AI-based analysis identifies chant families, traces regional variants, and reconstructs missing fragments from damaged scores. Algorithms trained on centuries of notation now predict how an unknown melody would have sounded. The past, once silent, is being taught to sing again. Standing in the sound archive, one hears none of this noise, only controlled, quiet, punctuated by the hum of machines. Yet in that silence lies potential resonance. The Vatican has always known that faith depends on hearing as much as seeing. Its phonographic legacy extends the Church's oldest promise, that the word, once spoken, will never be lost. And beyond the walls where voices are preserved, another archive begins, the one composed not of sound or text, but of humanity itself. The final stages of this journey will explore the Vatican's role as custodian of memory beyond religion, its collaborations in science, preservation of art under threat, and its enduring dialogue with the future. Among the lesser-known treasures of the Vatican lies a telescope. High above the papal summer residence at Castel Gandolfo, its dome gleams like a quiet contradiction, a reminder that the institution, once accused of opposing science, now studies the stars. The Specula Vaticana, or Vatican Observatory, represents the Church's long, complex reconciliation with the cosmos. Its archives, like those of theology and art, document centuries of curiosity disciplined by faith. The observatory's roots reach to the 16th century, when Gregory XIII reformed the calendar to align liturgical time with astronomical precision. Jesuit mathematicians at the Roman College compiled the Calendarium Gregorianum using instruments calibrated to the motion of the sun. Their correspondence, preserved in the Vatican's Archivio della Congregazione dei Riti, reveals an institution that saw no conflict between astronomy and devotion. Measuring the heavens was an act of humility, acknowledging creation's order rather than questioning its author. The modern observatory took shape under Leo XIII in 18. His encyclical Uta Mysticum declared that the Church should show the world that science and religion are not enemies but sisters. Within months, Jesuit astronomers installed telescopes atop the Vatican walls. Their mission combined research with symbolism to prove that faith could look outward as well as inward. The first photographic plates of the moon, taken from the Vatican Observatory, now rest in a temperature-controlled vault. each labelled by hand in Latin. Their delicate silver emulsions record not theology but curiosity, sanctified through precision. During the early 20th century, the observatory joined the Carte du Ciel project, an international collaboration to map the stars photographically. The Vatican contributed 10,000 glass plates to this celestial atlas. The archives preserve letters between Jesuit astronomer John Hagen and colleagues in Paris, discussing exposure times and cataloguing systems. These correspondences reveal scientists who wrote with the courtesy of diplomats and the discipline of monks. The Church had entered the scientific community not as patron but as peer. World War II forced relocation. The observatory moved from the Vatican walls to Castel Gandolfo, where the dark skies offered clearer observation. Its domes, visible from the Alban Hills, became a quiet counterpoint to the turmoil below. During the war, Jesuit scientists sheltered refugees in the same buildings that housed telescopes. Diaries kept by Father Daniel O'Connell describe nights spent alternating between stargazing and distributing food. Above, the heavens; below, humanity, he wrote. The juxtaposition became the observatory's enduring metaphor. After the war, light pollution gradually dimmed Rome's skies. In 1981, the Vatican founded a second observatory at Mount Graham in Arizona, operated jointly with American universities. The Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, its mirrors among the most precise ever built, symbolized global cooperation. Its data now feed into astronomical archives shared worldwide. Jesuit astronomers publish in peer-reviewed journals, their affiliations listed simply as Vatican Observatory. In the world of science, they are colleagues before they are clergy. The Church's engagement with science extends far beyond astronomy. The Pontifical Academy of Sciences, founded in 1603 as the Accademia dei Lincei Pontificia, counts Galileo, Newton, and Pasteur among its historical members. Its minutes, bound in red leather, chronicle debates on topics from evolution to quantum physics. The Academy's modern statutes, approved by Pius XI in 1936, define its mission as the advancement of science for the benefit of humanity, free from all prejudice. Its headquarters within the Casina Pio IV hosts Nobel laureates and theologians in the same marble halls where Renaissance cardinals once studied scripture. The juxtaposition is deliberate, reason and revelation sharing the same roof. One of the Academy's most enduring projects has been the study of climate change. Beginning in the 1980s, its scientists produced reports on deforestation, biodiversity, and global warming long before such issues dominated politics. The Vatican archives preserve the drafts of these conferences, where physicists and bishops debated not dogma but data. The language of stewardship gradually replaced dominion. Creation became environment. These scientific proceedings later informed papal encyclicals like Laudato Si 2015, which framed ecological concern as moral obligation. In this sense, science returned theology's favour, teaching faith how to speak in modern terms. The Vatican museums also embody this partnership between preservation and discovery. Their restoration laboratories rival those of major universities, employing chemists, physicists and conservators to study materials as if they were biological tissue. The Laboratorio del Restauro maintains detailed logs of pigment analysis, ultraviolet photography, and microclimate data. A single Raphael fresco may have thousands of measurements recorded in databases, cross-referenced with the archives. Conservation here is both art and science, chemistry as prayer. Another form of scientific collaboration emerged through the Vatican's role in cultural preservation. The Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology, founded in 1852, oversees excavations not only beneath Rome, but across the Mediterranean. Its archives contain reports on catacombs, mosaics and inscriptions, many salvaged from threatened sites. In recent decades, Vatican specialists have worked with UNESCO to document and protect artifacts endangered by war in Syria and Iraq. Their files include 3D scans of destroyed churches and virtual reconstructions of manuscripts lost to fire. In these efforts, the Vatican acts less as owner than as custodian of global heritage. The scientific ethos extends even to humanitarian archives. The Archivio Ufficio Informazioni Vaticano, created during World War II to track prisoners and missing persons, has evolved into a model for data ethics. Its modern counterpart aids in tracing migrants and refugees, combining humanitarian outreach with information management. The same discipline that once catalogued relics now catalogues lives. In both cases, precision is an act of compassion. Education remains the connecting thread. The Vatican supports universities and research institutes worldwide, from the Gregorian in Rome to the Catholic University of Leuven and the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. Their archives reveal a quiet network of intellectual exchange spanning continents. Correspondence between African, Asian, and Latin American scholars documents the globalization of Catholic scholarship, a new kind of missionary work conducted through ideas rather than territory. Through all these scientific and cultural ventures runs a consistent logic, knowledge as stewardship. The Church's acceptance of empirical inquiry stems not from concession, but from continuity. The same impulse that preserved manuscripts now preserves data. The same reverence that once protected relics now protects coral reefs. In the Vatican's view, science and theology serve the same end, understanding creation to better honor its creator. Standing inside the observatory's dome at Castel Gandolfo, one can see this philosophy made visible. The walls are lined with old instruments, brass astrolabes, star charts, telescopes polished by hand. Next to them, sleek computers blink quietly, recording photons from galaxies billions of years away. The juxtaposition is seamless. A Jesuit astronomer adjusts a lens, murmuring coordinates that sound like prayer. Outside, the Alban hills fade into dusk. The Vatican's gaze remains fixed both on heaven and on earth. And as these scientific records accumulate, they feed into one final archive, the collective memory of humanity itself. The Vatican's modern mission, increasingly, is to guard that memory from oblivion. The next section approaches that horizon, the archives of crises, wars, and civilizations at risk, where the Vatican's centuries of record-keeping become a service to the entire world. In the 21st century, the Vatican's archives have come to serve not only faith, but humanity's survival of memory. The same instinct that once preserved papal bulls and medieval codices now extends to the documentation of crises, wars, and lost cultures. The Holy See, through its network of nunciatures, museums, and humanitarian offices, has become an informal custodian of fragments that would otherwise vanish. Its archivists often describe their work as guarding the evidence of hope. The roots of this modern vocation lie in tragedy. During the Second World War, the Ufficio Informazioni Vaticano collected millions of letters from families searching for missing relatives. Its clerks, priests, nuns, and volunteers organized these requests on index cards that still fill metal drawers in the Secretariat of State. After the war, these files evolved into one of the largest civilian tracing services in existence. The Vatican later collaborated with the International Red Cross to digitize the collection, ensuring that each name would remain searchable long after the generation it belonged to had passed. What began as correspondence became an archive of compassion. This humanitarian instinct resurfaced in new contexts. During the Balkan conflicts of the 1990s, the Vatican's diplomatic missions transmitted information about displaced persons to Caritas Internationalis and the United Nations. Reports from Sarajevo, now declassified, show a meticulous concern for accuracy, numbers of refugees, lists of damaged churches, inventories of evacuated artworks. Each page blends humanitarian urgency with bureaucratic discipline. The Vatican's training in record-keeping, honed over centuries, had found new moral use. The protection of cultural heritage under threat became another extension of this mission. The Pontifical Council for Culture, established in 1982, coordinates with UNESCO and the International Council of Museums to safeguard religious art in zones of conflict. In 2015, when the ancient city of Palmyra was partially destroyed, the Vatican Museums contributed high-resolution scans of artifacts previously exhibited in Rome. Those digital files later aided restoration efforts after the site's recapture. The correspondence surrounding that collaboration, letters between curators, archaeologists, and diplomats, is now archived under the simple heading Syria. The word carries layers of both devastation and continuity. These partnerships have multiplied. Vatican experts have worked with Iraq's cultural authorities to restore manuscripts from Mosul, with the Louvre to identify looted Christian artifacts, and with African archives to preserve colonial-era church records now deteriorating under heat and humidity. The Vatican's role is rarely publicized. Its archives, however, document each act of quiet assistance. One folder labeled Congo 2018 contains reports on digitizing parish registers from the 19th century, preventing an entire lineage of community memory from disappearing. Another, Haiti 2010, lists art conservation teams dispatched after the earthquake, accompanied by photographs of restored icons. Each image is a rescue. The Holy See's diplomatic neutrality has proven essential to this form of preservation. Its embassies, or nunciatures, operate in nearly every country, often remaining open even when others close. Through them, the Vatican transmits not only messages, but materials, microfilms, digital drives, sealed packets of documentation. In the archives of the Secretariat of State, shipping manifests reveal this hidden traffic. Rolls of film labeled Iraq, Sites 2003, Sudan, Cathedrals 2005, Ukraine, Churches 2014. Each represents a collaboration to save memory before war erases it. Environmental disasters have added a new dimension to the Vatican's archival outreach. Following the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, local dioceses in India and Indonesia sent digital reports to Rome, describing loss of lives and property, but also the spontaneous solidarity among survivors. These were compiled into the Archivio Solidaritaire, an ongoing collection of disaster testimonies. Recent additions include documentation from the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, the 2019 Amazon fires, and the COVID-19 pandemic. The Vatican thus maintains a living chronicle of human resilience, bridging spiritual and civil history. The Church's humanitarian agencies have adopted modern data ethics, inspired by archival precision. Caritas Internationalis, headquartered in Rome, maintains vast databases of aid distribution and refugee assistance. Its records must balance transparency with privacy, an echo of the Vatican's own archival philosophy. When researchers analyze these files to assess policy impact, identifiers are encrypted, a procedure developed in consultation with the Vatican's Data Protection Office. The same attention once devoted to cataloguing manuscripts now safeguards human dignity through digital governance. Scientific and cultural collaborations further amplify this mission. The Vatican Museum's Reparto Diagnostico shares conservation technology with museums in developing countries, training local specialists to analyze pigments, wood, and textiles. Manuals produced from these workshops, printed in English, French, and Arabic, are archived both in Rome and in regional institutions. They form a dispersed but coherent record of shared stewardship. As one curator wrote in a report now catalogued under Partnerships 2019, "What we save together, we remember together." Even in its quietest operations, the Vatican's global presence produces a map of interconnected memory. The Apostolic Library maintains a program known as Manuscriptum Mundi, launched in 2017 to assist monasteries and universities in digitizing rare texts. From Armenia to Ethiopia, from Lebanon to Peru, scanners bearing the Vatican's insignia capture fragile pages for local archives. Each project leaves a duplicate stored in Rome, creating a decentralized repository of world heritage. The network now includes over 40 countries. In practice, the Vatican has become a silent backbone of global preservation. This shift from secrecy to service defines the modern era of the Vatican's archival mission. Its repositories, once symbols of exclusivity, now function as nodes in a planetary system of remembrance. Yet even as it extends outward, the Vatican remains mindful of the paradox that defines its identity. Knowledge must be protected to endure, but also shared to matter. The balance between those imperatives, guardianship and generosity, has become the ethical heart of its archives. Behind the statistics and technology, the human element persists. Many of the archivists now employed by the Vatican are lay professionals, historians, linguists, data engineers. Their backgrounds span continents and religions. Within the reading rooms, conversation shifts seamlessly from Latin to English to Arabic. The global church has become a global archive. One curator described the experience succinctly in a project log. We keep faith not by preserving belief, but by preserving evidence of belief. It is an insight that captures both the humility and ambition of their work. As these initiatives continue, the Vatican finds itself at the threshold of a new moral geography. Wars, climate change, and displacement have created an age where loss itself requires documentation. In this context, the Vatican's centuries of archival discipline have gained new relevance. Its method, precise, patient, and moral, offers a template for how humanity might remember itself amid fragmentation. The Holy See's archives, once seen as a fortress of secrecy, now function as repositories of shared survival. Beyond these halls, one final chapter remains, the reflection on why all this preservation matters. The Vatican's archives, whether of parchment or pixels, do not exist for nostalgia, but for continuity. In their quiet order lies a philosophy of time, that what we remember shapes what we become. The next and final section turns inward again, toward the meaning of secrecy, revelation, and memory at the end of this long journey through the Vatican's hidden world. Every archive is a mirror, and the Vatican's reflects not only the Church, but humanity itself. Our longing to preserve, our fear of forgetting. After 20 centuries of documents, art, music, and memory, the question arises, what is the purpose of keeping everything? The answer, found between the lines of papal decrees and curator notes, is both humble and immense. Preservation is not about control, it is about continuity. The Vatican's greatest secret may be that secrecy itself was never its goal. It has always been a language of care. The institution's modern philosophy of archives began to take shape in 1881, when Leo XIII opened the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum to researchers. His decree reframed the idea of secrecy. Secretum, he wrote, does not mean hidden, but private, kept safe for responsibility's sake. That semantic shift changed everything. For centuries, the archive had been a metaphor for authority. Now it became a laboratory of accountability. The Vatican's hidden knowledge was not concealed from the world, but entrusted to it through method and discipline. Access became a sacred duty, not a privilege. The same principle guides its operations today. The Archivist's Code of Ethics, drafted in 1998, describes their task as serving truth through preservation. They view each document not as possession, but as witness. When scholars request access to a papal letter, they sign a declaration acknowledging the moral weight of what they read. The process is ceremonial, but sincere. Every act of study is a continuation of history itself. In a world driven by novelty, the archive teaches patience, the slow rhythm of truth revealed in layers. Walking through its corridors at dawn, one feels that time has been tamed, but not silenced. The stone floors bear grooves from centuries of carts carrying manuscripts. The scent of vellum mingles with ozone from digital scanners. Every sound seems absorbed into the calm hum of continuity. In one corner lies a manuscript of Augustine's City of God, in another, a hard drive labelled Digitization Project 2030. Between them stretch 1500 years of human intention, evidence that our pursuit of understanding never truly changes, only its instruments. The archive's paradox lies in its dual nature. It is both finite and infinite. Each shelf has limits, yet the accumulation approaches eternity. Archivists speak of this tension with reverence. One senior custodian, interviewed for an internal report, compared his work to monastic prayer. We order chaos so that others may contemplate. The phrase captures the Vatican's silent creed: knowledge as devotion, order as offering. Their work turns time into trust. The walls themselves carry the weight of that trust. Deep beneath the Cortile del Belvedere, temperature-controlled vaults store microfilms of world archives, collections from Armenia, Ethiopia, Poland, China. The Vatican holds copies not to claim ownership, but to safeguard diversity. In a sense, humanity's collective memory converges here, protected by an institution that has learned to survive every political and cultural storm. Where empires fell, the archive endured, quietly writing the footnotes of civilization. Yet secrecy, though redefined, still holds symbolic power. Scholars speak of the closed boxes, records not yet released, awaiting the slow passage of time. Their contents are rarely sensational: personnel files, correspondence, diplomatic minutiae. But the ritual of restriction serves a deeper function. It reminds the world that not all truth is immediate. Some histories require distance to be understood. In this delay lies wisdom, the discipline of waiting for perspective. The Vatican's patience, often mistaken for concealment, is in fact its most consistent act of faith. Popes have written about this philosophy with unexpected poetry. John Paul II described the archives as a memory of humanity purified by faith. Benedict XVI called them a sign that truth is not invented but inherited, and Francis, addressing archivists in 2019, urged them to make memory an act of mercy. Each phrase reflects the same conviction that remembering truthfully is a moral obligation. The Vatican's preservation of its own complexities, its triumphs and failures, demonstrates that conviction in practice. The rhythm of work here resists the tempo of modern life. Each document undergoes cleaning, cataloguing, digitization, and indexing, a process that can take months. The archivists measure progress not in terabytes but in trust accumulated. Visitors often remark on the quiet: no alarms, no rushing, only the steady click of keyboards and the turn of pages. It is the sound of civilization taking its pulse. What emerges from this long stewardship is not a hoard of secrets, but a theology of memory. In Catholic tradition, remembrance is sacred. The Mass itself begins with the command, "Do this in memory of me." Every archive, in that sense, extends the liturgy of continuity, the belief that salvation, like knowledge, depends on recall. Forgetting is the only true heresy. This is why the Vatican's archive, for all its administrative formality, feels almost sacramental. It keeps faith with time. The future of this mission now unfolds in silence and light. Digital vaults replace paper shelves, but the intention remains unchanged. Preservation as participation in creation. The Vatican's ongoing projects with universities and cultural institutions ensure that its holdings, once locked behind stone, now circulate globally as shared heritage. The paradox deepens. The more it opens, the more it becomes what it was meant to be. Those who have walked its corridors often describe a peculiar sensation, that the past, instead of being behind, surrounds them. Here, history is not linear but circular, looping back upon itself in cycles of revelation. The archivists move within this circle like stewards of an unseen dialogue between centuries. Each signature, each seal, each line of Latin script whispers that time is not an enemy, but an ally, when treated with care. And yet, beyond philosophy, there is still wonder. Somewhere in these vaults lie the letters of Galileo and Bernini, the decrees of emperors, the maps of missionaries, the pleas of unknown believers, all waiting in patient equilibrium. The Vatican does not claim to own them, it merely holds them until the world is ready to listen. The archives are less a fortress than a threshold, a space where faith and curiosity meet without fear. Standing at the end of this journey, you realize that the mysteries hidden in the Vatican are not conspiracies, but continuities, the persistence of human thought against decay. The true secret is endurance. What survives here is not power, but patience, the conviction that truth, however fragile, deserves to be remembered until it can speak for itself. Outside the bells of St. Peter's mark another hour. Their sound threads through stone and server alike, echoing the same rhythm that has governed these walls for 600 years. The archives rest once more in silence, their shelves breathing with the weight of centuries. And in that silence you understand. The Vatican's greatest mystery was never what it hid, but how faithfully it remembered.